She had nothing. He had everything. And the first thing she ever said to him cracked something open inside his chest that 3 years of silence had sealed shut. He was a billionaire standing in his own backyard, staring at a woman he had no business wanting. And she caught him looking. She didn't blush, didn't look away. She smiled and said, "If you want to see, just ask." 4 words. That's all it took. Now drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. The evening Adrian Sterling came home and found a moving truck parked next door, he almost didn't notice it. He was carrying Sophie on his back, his 7-year-old daughter who weighed approximately 42 pounds but argued like she weighed 400. And she was in the middle of explaining, with full seriousness, why spaghetti was superior to every other food in human history. "It's just science, Dad," she said, bouncing against his shoulders. "Long noodles are better than short noodles. That's just how physics works." That's not what physics means. It means things that are true. He laughed despite himself. That happened a lot with Sophie. She had a way of making him forget, for a few minutes at a time, that anything else existed. The truck was white and dented, with a rear door that had been duct-taped at one corner. 2 men were muscling a sofa through the side gate of the small rental house adjacent to his property. The one that had sat empty for almost 8 months, the one whose landlord had let the flower beds go completely to seed, and whose gutters sagged on the left side like a tired mouth. Adrian didn't give it much thought. He shifted Sophie's weight, fished his keys out of his jacket pocket, and pushed through his front door. The house enveloped him the way it always did, cool, quiet, and expensive in a way that had stopped feeling like comfort years ago. Floor-to-ceiling windows, herringbone hardwood, a kitchen that had been designed by an architect who specialized in kitchens for people who didn't cook. Adrian cooked. He'd learned out of necessity when Sophie was 4, and he'd fired the 3rd nanny in 6 months for reasons he still couldn't fully articulate. Something about the way she talked at Sophie instead of to her, like the child was a piece of furniture that occasionally needed rearranging. He'd figured out pasta first, then scrambled eggs, then slowly the rest. "Spaghetti tonight?" Sophie asked from somewhere behind him. She'd already wriggled down and was now padding toward the kitchen in her socks, leaving a trail of dropped hair ties. "We had spaghetti Tuesday, and it was great Tuesday. Thursday is chicken." Sophie made the face. The face had a name in the Sterling household. The condition. It involved a furrowed brow, a dropped lip, and eyes that went approximately 17% wider than normal. It had never once worked on him. He responded to it every single time anyway. "I'll put extra garlic in," he said. The condition dissolved instantly. "Okay, but I want to help." "You can stir." "I want to cut." "You're 7. Almost 8. That's still 7. She huffed and climbed onto the kitchen stool with the dignity of someone who had made their objections known and chosen, strategically, not to press further. Adrian pulled the chicken from the refrigerator and pretended not to notice the small smile she was hiding behind her hand. The neighborhood was called Millbrook Heights, which was one of those names designed to sound aspirational without saying anything specific. It was a quiet street in the outer edge of a suburb that hadn't fully decided what it wanted to be. Old money on the north side, newer construction creeping in from the south, and somewhere in the middle, a half-dozen homes that had been there long enough to look like they'd earned their place. Adrian's house was the largest on the block by a significant margin. He'd bought it 3 years ago when he moved Sophie out of the city, out of the penthouse apartment that still smelled somehow like Victoria's perfume even after 2 rounds of professional cleaning. He hadn't bought it to show off. He'd bought it because it had a backyard with a real lawn, a magnolia tree that bloomed in April, and a front porch where a kid could sit and watch the world go by without being watched herself. Sophie had picked out the mailbox. She'd chosen one shaped like a rooster, which Adrian thought was objectively hideous, and which he'd installed anyway on a Saturday afternoon while she supervised from a lawn chair. The rooster was still there. He'd grown almost fond of it. He didn't see the new neighbor until the following week. It was a Thursday evening, just past 6:30. Sophie was at a sleepover at her friend Maya's house, the first sleepover she'd agreed to attend in 4 months, which felt like progress, or at least like something worth not overthinking. And Adrian was in the backyard doing the one thing that he'd discovered actually quieted his brain. Gardening. He'd started it as a joke, almost. Something to do with his hands when the conference calls ended and the reports were filed and the house felt like a museum. His head of operations, a no-nonsense woman named Karen Bledsoe, who had worked for him for 6 years and had zero patience for what she called billionaire spiraling, had told him bluntly, "Find something that doesn't have a deliverable, or you'll lose your mind by 40. He'd started with the rose bushes along the back fence, then a small vegetable plot, then herbs. Now there was a whole corner of the yard that Sophie called the jungle, where tomatoes climbed wire cages and basil grew in messy clusters, and a single, stubbornly unproductive pepper plant that Adrian refused to give up on had been occupying the same spot for 2 seasons. He was crouched beside the pepper plant, doing something that could generously be called pruning, and less generously be called just poking at it with a stick, when he heard movement on the other side of the fence. He straightened. The fence between his property and the rental house was 6 feet of weathered cedar, solid but old. There were gaps in the upper slats that let through strips of evening light, and through one of those gaps, Adrian could see the back garden of the rental house, which had been a wasteland of dead grass and abandoned pots for the better part of a year. It was no longer a wasteland. Someone had been busy. He couldn't see much, just sections, like a painting glimpsed through a keyhole, a patch of freshly turned earth, a row of small clay pots lined along the bottom of the back steps, a trowel lying across the rim of a bucket, a kneeling figure in worn jeans and a loose green shirt, hair pulled back with what appeared to be an actual pencil, working at a pace that suggested she'd been at it for a while. She. He could see enough to know that. He watched for probably 3 seconds longer than was appropriate. Maybe 5. He was genuinely not sure. Then she turned, reached for a water bottle beside her knee, and looked up. Their eyes met through the gap in the fence. She didn't flinch, didn't look embarrassed. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you've decided, in about half a second, exactly what kind of person they are. Then she smiled. "If you want to see," she said, "just ask." Adrian opened his mouth. Nothing came out, which was, for a man who ran a company with 1,100 employees and regularly sat across from institutional investors who were trying to take things from him, embarrassing. "Sorry," he said finally. I didn't mean to." "You were gardening," she said. "I was gardening. You looked over, completely normal." She tilted her head slightly. "Kind of." He didn't know what to do with that, so he said the first concrete thing that came to mind. Those pots. The ones on the steps. Those are petunias?" She glanced back at them. "Snapdragons. The pink ones are snapdragons. Those 2 on the end are lavender, but they're struggling. I'm not sure this soil is going to cooperate. The soil over here is mostly clay, drains badly." She raised an eyebrow. "You know about soil?" "I know enough to be annoying about it." A short laugh, unguarded. It surprised him. "Emily Carter," she said, and didn't reach across the fence because there was a fence, but lifted one soil-dirty hand in something between a wave and an acknowledgement. "Adrian Sterling. You've lived here a while?" 3 years. "Is it a good street?" He thought about it for a second. Really thought about it, rather than just defaulting to polite. "Quiet," he said. "The Hendersons 2 doors down have a dog that loses its mind every garbage day, but you get used to it. The maple tree on the corner is beautiful in October, and the guy on the corner with the boat in his driveway never actually takes it anywhere. So if you ever need to use a boat for some reason, I wouldn't start there." Emily looked at him for a moment. "That's a very specific endorsement." "I answered the question." "You did." She picked up her trowel. "Nice to meet you, Adrian Sterling." "Nice to meet you, Emily Carter." She went back to her planting. He went back to poking the pepper plant, and that was how it started. Not with fireworks or dramatic weather or anything worth writing down. Just 2 people on opposite sides of a fence, saying each other's names for the first time, while the evening light did what evening light does in early summer, which is mostly just make everything look a little more forgiving than it actually is. He didn't know she was struggling. He didn't find out until later, much later, that Emily Carter had moved into the rental house with exactly $1,140 in her checking account, a 2009 Civic with a check engine light she'd been ignoring for 6 months, and the specific, hollowed-out exhaustion of someone who had spent the last 2 years of her marriage slowly understanding that the person she'd chosen had never actually chosen her back. She didn't look broken. That was the thing. She looked capable, competent, like someone who'd taken stock of a situation and decided, with some stubbornness that might have been a flaw or a virtue depending on the day, to handle it. She'd started a small landscaping business 9 months ago. Just herself and a website she'd built from a YouTube tutorial and a secondhand mower she'd bought off a Facebook listing. She had 6 clients. 7 after she talked the Hendersons into letting her redesign their front beds, which she did the second week she lived on the street by simply knocking on their door and asking if she could show them some sketches. Adrian didn't know any of this yet. What he knew was that she'd been at the rental house for a week, that she was fixing the back garden on her own time and money, and that she had said if you want to see, just ask, and meant it as practically nothing. Just a light joke, an easy deflection, but that the words had landed somewhere in his chest and were, irritatingly, still there. Sophie found out about Emily before Adrian could decide what, if anything, to do about the fact that he'd been thinking about a conversation with a stranger more than was strictly reasonable. It happened on Saturday morning. Sophie had come back from the sleepover in the specific condition of someone who had slept 3 hours and consumed a quantity of sugar that violated several dietary guidelines, which meant she was simultaneously wired and fragile and needed both space and company, a combination that Adrian had become reasonably skilled at navigating. He put her in the backyard with a popsicle and a book while he pruned the rose bushes, which mostly meant she read 3 pages and then walked around eating the popsicle and asking questions. "What's that sound?" "Probably Mrs. Henderson's dog." "No, that other sound." He listened. Someone was mowing on the other side of the fence. "The new neighbor," he said. Sophie's whole body oriented toward the fence like a compass finding north. "There's a new neighbor?" "Moved in last week. Why didn't you tell me?" "I forgot." "Dad." She said it the way she said a lot of things, with the patient exasperation of someone who had privately decided she was more mature than the adults around her and had chosen not to make a big deal about it. "You forgot there was a new person living next door to us." "I've been busy." "You're always busy." He didn't argue that because it was true. He kept pruning. Sophie ate her popsicle. Then she walked to the fence, found a gap at approximately her eye level, and looked through it with absolutely no self-consciousness whatsoever. "She's got red hair," Sophie reported. "Don't stare." "You stared." He turned around. "How do you know that?" Sophie gave him a look that suggested she didn't need evidence. She had instincts. "Is she nice?" "I spoke to her for about 4 minutes." "Was she nice in 4 minutes?" He went back to the rose bushes. "She seemed like it." This was, to Sophie, apparently sufficient. She called over the fence. "Hello?" The mower stopped. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. "Hi there!" Emily's voice came from the other side. "I'm Sophie. My dad lives here. I'm visiting. Well, I live here too. I just mean—" She paused, recalibrating. "I heard you mowing." "I was definitely mowing. Are you the new neighbor?" "Guilty." Sophie glanced back at her father with an expression that communicated, "See, this is how you talk to people," and then returned to the fence. "Do you want to come talk to us? There's a gate. It's on the side. Dad, where's the gate?" "Sophie?" "It's fine, Dad. She's nice." Then back through the fence. "Are you nice?" A pause. Then a laugh that was, if anything, warmer than the one from Thursday night. "I have my moments." Down. Emily came through the gate with dirt on her knees and her hair escaping from a ponytail that had given up sometime around noon. She was carrying her gardening gloves in one hand because she'd remembered to pull them off and had nowhere to put them. She looked, Adrian thought, like someone who was very at home in the world when the world was making her work for it. "Nice yard," she said, taking in the roses and the raised beds and the jungle corner where the tomatoes were beginning to assert themselves. "Thank you. You did all of this yourself?" "Over 3 years, mostly by failing and trying again. The best kind." She crouched down to Sophie's level, not in a performed talking to a child way, but the way someone does when they actually want to make eye contact. "I like your popsicle color. Orange? Mango," Sophie said. "It's technically the best one, but most people disagree." "I think mango is underrated." Sophie blinked. This was, apparently, the correct answer. She offered the popsicle. "Sophie, you've had that popsicle for 20 minutes, Adrian said. "It's fine," Emily said, and took a small bite from the end. and Sophie looked at her father with an expression that meant she passed. They stood in the backyard and talked for 40 minutes. Not about anything significant. The state of the soil, bad. The snapdragons Emily had planted, optimistic. The magnolia tree at the back of Adrian's property that was blocking the light for the side beds, a problem he'd been ignoring. Sophie contributed opinions on all of it. Emily took them seriously, which Sophie noticed and filed away. When Emily left, walking back through the side gate with her gloves stuffed in her pocket, and a wave that was easy and not self-conscious, Sophie watched her go. "I like her," she said. "I know. She didn't talk to me like I was little." "I noticed." Sophie looked up at him. "Are you going to be weird about her?" Adrian looked down at his daughter. "What does that mean?" "Like when Mrs. Patterson from school tried to talk to you at the pickup line, and you pretended your phone rang even though your phone didn't ring. I heard it. There was no ringtone." He had absolutely no response to that. "You could just talk to her," Sophie said. "She's right there. Literally right there." She pointed at the fence. "And she knows about soil." The weeks that followed had a rhythm that Adrian hadn't anticipated. It wasn't planned. There was no decision made, no moment where Adrian said to himself, "I will now pursue a friendship with the woman next door." It was more like water finding its level, small increments, almost invisible individually, that added up to something you noticed only once it was already there. It started with the lemonade. Emily had a lemon tree in a large pot on her back steps, something she'd apparently hauled from her previous life, which Adrian was curious about but hadn't asked. And she made lemonade the old way, squeezed and sugared and not quite sweet enough, which was exactly how he liked it. The first time she brought a glass over the fence was because she'd made too much. The second time was because she'd made too much again. The third time, Adrian brought the glass back washed, and she laughed and said she'd stop pretending she hadn't been making too much on purpose. They fell into a habit. Late evenings, when the heat broke and the light went gold, one or the other would end up on their side of the fence, and conversation would happen through the slats or across the top, or increasingly, through the gate that Sophie had made a point of leaving unlatched. They talked about this garden, about the pepper plant, which Emily looked at with the professional assessment of someone who had seen failure in that specific form before, and said, "You're overwatering it. You love it too much, and it's drowning." Adrian had stood there for a moment and said nothing, because the observation was about a pepper plant and also somehow wasn't. She didn't seem to notice. She was already crouching down, pressing a finger into the soil, checking moisture levels with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Let it dry out between waterings," she said. "It needs to struggle a little." She didn't know she'd said anything other than gardening advice. He was certain of that. They talked about Sophie, about the sleepover progress, about the school project on ecosystems that Sophie had decided should focus entirely on the specific ecosystem of the backyard, which Emily had enthusiastically volunteered to help with, which meant 2 Tuesday afternoons with soil samples and a magnifying glass and a hand-drawn chart that was ambitious in scope and shaky in execution, but completely sincere. One evening, Sophie came out of the house with her hair a genuine disaster. She'd been trying to braid it herself, and the result was something that looked like it had been attempted in the dark during an earthquake. And Emily had taken one look at it and said, "Come here." And Sophie had sat on the back step, and Emily had sat behind her and talked her through a simple 3-strand braid, while Sophie asked her 17 questions about everything except the braid. And Adrian had watched from the garden and felt something that he deliberately didn't name. It was becoming harder to keep not naming it. The thing that Emily didn't know, that nobody on Millbrook Heights knew, because Adrian had been careful about it in the way that people are careful about things they've decided aren't relevant, was the company. Sterling Engineering and Infrastructure Group, privately held. 1,100 employees across 4 states. Contracts with municipal governments, private development firms, and 2 projects currently in preliminary design that, if they came through, would represent the largest revenue year in the company's history. He'd built it from scratch, from a structural engineering degree and a borrowed office and a first project that was so small it paid for exactly 1 month of rent and left him eating rice and beans for the following 3 weeks. He'd been 23. He'd been looking back completely out of his mind with ambition in the specific way that people are when they have nothing to lose yet. The company was worth, as of the last independent valuation, somewhere north of $400 million. He drove a 5-year-old Range Rover. Not because he couldn't afford something newer. He owned 3 other cars, including a car he'd bought in a moment of weakness and had driven twice. But because the Range Rover was practical for hauling Sophie's school projects, which tended to be large, and for the occasional Saturday trip to the landscape supply yard, where he bought soil amendments in quantities that the woman behind the counter had stopped commenting on. He didn't carry himself like someone with $400 million. He'd never worked out how that was supposed to feel. Most days it felt like a number in a spreadsheet. What felt real was the pepper plant and the chicken on Thursdays and the rooster mailbox that Sophie had picked out, and the evening light coming through the magnolia tree when the summer went long. Emily had no idea. He'd thought early on that he should tell her, but the moment never presented itself naturally, and the longer he didn't, the more he found himself valuing the fact that she talked to him like he was just a person, which, he was realizing, he hadn't experienced in a while. People knew who he was. People who knew who he was talked to him through that knowledge. Carefully, strategically, with one eye on what they might want from him, or what impression they wanted to make. Even people who liked him were complicated by what he represented. Emily asked him if his pepper plant was getting too much water, and meant exactly that. He was not, he admitted to himself one evening when Sophie was asleep and the house was quiet and he was sitting on the back porch with a drink. He wasn't really tasting, handling this particularly well. The conversation that shifted things happened on a Wednesday. Sophie had gone to bed. The weather had turned the way it does in late summer when the first hint of autumn comes through on a western breeze and makes everything smell like the end of something. Adrian was sitting on the back porch steps when he heard Emily's back door open, and then the small sounds of someone settling into the chair she'd set up near the fence, a wicker thing she'd found at a garage sale and had been meaning to repaint for weeks. "Can't sleep?" she called over. "Not trying yet." A pause. "Me neither." He looked at the sky. It was one of those nights where the clouds were thin enough that the stars were partly visible, which in a suburb meant maybe a dozen of them, the brightest ones, the ones stubborn enough to punch through the light pollution. Sophie had asked him once which star was her favorite, and he told her that was like asking him which spaghetti noodle was his favorite. And she had said without hesitation, the long ones, and had not seemed to appreciate that she'd made his point for him. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said. "Sure." A beat. "What happened with Sophie's mother? You don't have to tell me. I've been wondering." He thought about deflecting. It was his default. The smooth redirect, the half answer that communicated I'm fine with this topic without actually engaging with it. He'd gotten very good at it. "She left," he said instead. "When?" Sophie was 4, right before Christmas. He paused. "She said I was boring, that I'd turned into someone she didn't recognize, that she needed more than what we had." He could still hear Victoria's voice when she said it. Not angry, which would have been easier, but tired. Like she'd been carrying the disappointment for so long that she'd run out of feeling for it. She was probably right about some of it. I wasn't easy to live with. I was building the company and I missed things. A lot of things. But I thought we were building something, both of us. Turns out we had different ideas about what that meant. Silence on the other side of the fence. "I'm sorry," Emily said. "Don't be. I'm over it." He felt the inadequacy of that as he said it. Or, "I'm through it." That's a different thing. I'm not over it the way you get over something that didn't matter, but it doesn't own me anymore. When did it stop owning you? He thought about that seriously. Somewhere around the 3rd time Sophie made me laugh in the same hour. She's very efficient at that. "She is." He could hear the smile in it. "She's a really good kid, Adrian. She's better than I deserve." "Stop that." He looked toward the fence. "What?" "That thing where you give yourself less credit than you should. I've noticed you do it. You talk about her like you got lucky, like you just happened to be there and she turned out well despite you. But she didn't. She turned out like that because of you, the way she talks to people, the way she notices things. That doesn't come from nowhere." Adrian didn't say anything. There was a constriction in his chest that he recognized as the specific feeling of being seen in a way he hadn't given permission for. "You could say thank you," Emily said, and he could hear the gentle tease in it. "Thank you," he said. His voice was slightly rougher than he intended. "You're welcome." She shifted in her wicker chair. He could hear the creak of it. "You want to know something stupid? I thought the house next door to mine when I was married was going to be our forever house. We were going to have a garden and the whole thing. He didn't want a garden. He didn't really want a lot of things." A pause. He wanted the idea of a life. He just didn't want to do the actual living of it. How long were you married? 6 years. Another pause. I kept thinking it was me, that I wasn't enough of whatever it was he needed, exciting enough, interesting enough. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. You know what's embarrassing? I used to read articles about it, how to keep him interested. Like it was a puzzle I could solve if I just figured out the right combination. That's not embarrassing, Adrian said. That's what people do when they care about something. They try to fix it, even when it's not fixable. Even then, a long quiet, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable. Steady men aren't boring, Emily said eventually. He wasn't sure at first that she was talking to him. I know you said she called you boring, Victoria. I know you didn't use that word, but I could tell that's what it was. She paused. Steady men are rare. Someone who actually shows up every day, who does the thing he said he'd do, who's there when the kid needs him and there when the kid doesn't. That's not boring. That's the whole point. That's what everything else is supposed to be in service of. Adrian sat with that for a moment. She made it sound like a flaw, he said. I know. That's on her. He looked at the thin scatter of stars above the backyard. The magnolia tree was a dark shape against the lighter dark of the sky. The jungle corner was invisible in the shadows. Emily. Yeah. I'm glad you moved in next door. A pause. Then simply, me too. Go. He didn't sleep well that night, but not for any of the reasons he was used to. Usually when sleep was hard, it was the company, a decision that hadn't been made yet, a contract term that needed another pass, the low-grade static of a problem that didn't have a clean solution. That kind of sleeplessness was almost comfortable. It had a purpose. This was different. This was the feeling of something moving that he'd thought was still, something he'd told himself was fine, settled, finished, and apparently it wasn't. He lay on his back in the dark and thought about a woman who made too much lemonade on purpose and fixed dead gardens and sat in a wicker chair that creaked and talked about his daughter the way he'd wanted someone to talk about her for 3 years and had just given up hoping for. He thought, this is how it starts. And then he thought, don't. And then he lay there for another hour, staring at the ceiling, completely failing to listen to himself. September came in warm and easy, the way it occasionally does before it remembers what it's supposed to be doing. Sophie turned 8. The party was small. 4 friends from school, the backyard strung with lights, a cake that Adrian made from scratch with considerably more effort and less aesthetic success than he'd hoped for. It was technically chocolate. It leaned slightly to the left. Sophie called it rustic, which was a word she'd recently learned and was deploying with enthusiasm in multiple contexts. Emily had come to the gate that afternoon with a small pot of blooming snapdragons, the pink ones, finally recovered from the rough start, tied with a ribbon, and a card Sophie had seen her slip quietly into the stack without making a thing of it. Later, when Adrian was cleaning up, and Sophie was inside with her friends watching something loud on the TV, he found the card on the kitchen counter. It said, in Emily's handwriting, which was the handwriting of someone who'd never fully abandoned cursive, Happy 8th. You are the kind of person who makes rooms better just by walking into them. Don't let anyone talk you out of that. He put it back on the counter. He left it there. He went outside and stood in the backyard in the leftover light of the party. The string lights still on, the paper plates collected but the napkins still scattered, and looked at the fence. He wasn't ready. He knew he wasn't ready. He also knew, with the clarity that comes sometimes in the specific quiet after a child's birthday party when the friends have gone and the cake has been eaten and the world has briefly been small and manageable and good, he knew that the thing he wasn't ready for was happening anyway, whether he was ready or not. The pepper plant, 2 days later, produced its first pepper. It was small, slightly lopsided, more pale green than it should have been. Adrian stood in front of it for a long moment. Then he went to the gate, knocked on the fence post, and said, Emily, you need to come see this. She came through the gate in her work boots and her soil-dirty jeans, and she crouched down and looked at the pepper with the gravity it deserved, and then she looked up at him with a real, uncomplicated smile. Told you, she said. Let it struggle a little. It'll figure itself out. He looked at her for exactly 1 second too long. She noticed. She stood up, and neither of them said anything about it, and they went back to their respective sides of the fence, and the evening went on the way evenings do. But something had shifted. Both of them knew it. Neither of them was quite ready to say so yet, and that for now was okay. The pepper sat on Adrian's kitchen windowsill for 3 days before he ate it. He wasn't sure why he didn't eat it immediately. It was a pepper. He'd grown it to eat it. That was the entire point of a vegetable garden, the eating of it, a fact that Sophie had pointed out with some exasperation when she came home from school and found it still sitting there, slightly more pale than it had been, looking like it had questions. "Dad, it's a pepper." "I know what it is." "Then why is it just sitting there?" "I'm going to eat it." "When?" He didn't have a good answer for that, so he redirected her toward homework, which worked about 60% of the time. This was one of the 60%. She went. He stood in the kitchen for another moment, looking at the pepper, and then deliberately turned away and started making dinner. The truth, which he wasn't examining too carefully, because it had the quality of something that would become embarrassing if held up to direct light, was that the pepper had become, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, a marker. Emily had been right about it. She'd been right about the overwatering, right about letting it struggle, right about the fact that it would figure itself out if he stopped hovering over it like something precious and fragile. He didn't want to eat the marker. He ate it on the 4th day, sliced thin over eggs, and it was a little bitter and not quite right, and also probably the best pepper he'd ever grown. He didn't tell Emily that part. He just said, when she asked, that he'd finally eaten it. And? It was good. She looked at him with the particular expression she had when she suspected he was underselling something. Just good? It was really good. That's what I thought. She went back to whatever she was doing on her side of the fence. She'd been rebuilding the small stone border around her back flower bed, a project that involved considerably more precision than it looked like, and that she'd been at for most of the afternoon. And Adrian went back to his rose bushes, and neither of them made anything of it. That was October. By November, the rhythm had deepened into something that Adrian had stopped pretending was casual. Emily was over 3 or 4 evenings a week, sometimes through the gate, sometimes just voices over the fence. Sophie had started assuming Emily would be there for certain things, not in a demanding way, not in the way that would have worried Adrian, but in the easy, unconscious way that children have of incorporating people into their world once they've decided those people belong there. Sophie's world had a fence, and a rooster mailbox, and Thursday chicken, and Emily Carter. And that was how things were. Sophie had started coming home from school with questions that were specifically for Emily, not because Adrian couldn't answer them. He could answer most of them, and the ones he couldn't, he'd look up. But because Emily's answers had a different texture, more tangible, more willing to say I don't know, but here's how we'd find out rather than defaulting to the correct fact. Emily says the best way to learn something is to mess it up first, Sophie told him one evening, with the air of someone sharing wisdom. Emily is correct, Adrian said. She said you mess up your garden all the time, and that's why it's so good. She said that? She said it nicely. He didn't push, but later he mentioned it to Emily, and she didn't look remotely apologetic. I said it was an ongoing experiment, which is true. You're not precious about it. That's why it works. I'm told I was overwatering the pepper. You were. And then you stopped and it grew. She shrugged. That's the whole lesson. He thought she was still talking about plants. He was about 70% sure she was still talking about plants. The problem, and Adrian had started privately using the word problem, which was its own kind of admission, was that knowing something was happening and knowing what to do about it were completely separate categories of knowledge. He was 42, recently divorced in the past 3 years, with a 7-year-old and a company and a life that was, by most reasonable measures, full. He had not planned to want anything. He had made something of a project out of not wanting anything, of being a person who was fine, who had what he needed, who was not in the market for complication. And then Emily Carter had moved in next door and fixed her back garden and made too much lemonade and braided Sophie's hair and told him that steady men were rare, and now he was eating a pepper off his kitchen windowsill like it meant something, and having conversations over a fence in the dark, and he was not fine. Not exactly. Not in a bad way. Just in the way of someone standing at the edge of something big, looking at the water, knowing they're going to jump and not quite having done it yet. Karen Bledsoe noticed first. She always noticed first, which was part of why he paid her well, and also part of why she occasionally terrified him. She came to his home office on a Thursday morning. She did this once a week, working session, reviewing the things he didn't want to deal with over a video call. And about 40 minutes in, when they'd gotten through the Harmon contract and the personnel situation in the Atlanta office, she put down her folder and looked at him. "You're distracted," she said. "I'm always distracted. You're a different kind of distracted." She studied him the way she studied quarterly reports, not unkindly, but without mercy. "Is it the Henderson deposition?" "No." "The refinancing timeline?" "We've handled it." A pause. "Is it a person?" Adrian picked up his coffee. "Let's talk about the Atlanta situation." Karen had worked for him for 6 years. She had watched him build the company, watched him navigate the divorce with a specificity of quiet that she had never commented on directly, watched him learn to be a single father with the same rigorous, methodical attention he brought to structural load calculations. She was 51 and married and had 3 adult children, and she brought homemade kolaches to staff meetings, and she did not, as a rule, pry. She also knew when not to drop something. "Okay," she said, and picked up her folder. Atlanta. But when she was leaving, standing at his front door with her coat on, she turned and said without preamble, "You've been alone a long time, Adrian." He didn't say anything. "That's all." She pulled on her gloves. "Atlanta's situation is solvable. The other thing usually is, too." She paused. "How's Sophie?" "She's great." "Good," Karen nodded. "She deserves great." And then she left. He stood at the door for a minute after her car pulled out of the driveway. He was aware that he'd been given, in the particular language of Karen Bledsoe, something very close to a blessing. He wasn't sure what to do with it. He went back inside and looked at the empty windowsill where the pepper had been. Then he pulled out his phone and sent Emily a text that said, "The Hendersons want to redo their front beds before the first frost. I told them you were good. Hope that's okay." Her response came 4 minutes later. "That's 3 jobs this week. You're basically my marketing department." He typed, "I prefer strategic business development consultant." She sent back, "I'm paying you in lemonade." He looked at his phone for a moment longer than the exchange warranted. Then he put it face down on his desk and tried very hard to focus on the Atlanta situation. He was moderately successful. The Tuesday that changed the specific texture of things was the second week of November, which in that part of the country meant gray skies and the smell of something burning pleasantly from a neighbor's fireplace 2 streets over, and leaves on the ground in various stages of becoming mulch. Sophie had a project. The project was about habitats, specifically the ecosystem project she'd been working on with Emily's help. And it had grown considerably since its inception into something that now included a 3-panel poster board, 6 soil samples in labeled jars, a hand-drawn diagram of the food chain in Adrian's backyard that featured, notably, a worm that Sophie had named Gerald and drawn with a small expression of determination, and a section on native pollinators that Emily had spent an afternoon talking Sophie through with the specific, undramatic knowledge of someone who'd spent years working with plants and just knew things about bees. The project was due Friday. It was currently Tuesday. There were, Sophie had announced at dinner, several sections that still needed finishing. "How several?" Adrian asked. Sophie held up 3 fingers. "Which 3? "The conclusion. The bibliography. And I need to redo the B section because I spelled pollinator wrong on the poster, and now it says pollinator. And Maya said that sounded like something from outer space. Maya's not wrong. Dad, we can fix the spelling. I also want to add a part about the pepper." He looked at her. "The pepper. Gerald eats things that break down the soil, which makes the soil better, which made your pepper grow. It's all connected." Sophie said this with the confident authority of someone who had recently discovered systems thinking and found it very satisfying. Emily said everything's connected if you look at it right. Emily says a lot of useful things. Can she come over tonight to help finish? He wanted to say she doesn't have to come every time we need something, because it was true, and also because Sophie's attachment to Emily was something he watched carefully. Not with alarm, but with the awareness of someone who knew what loss looked like on a child's face and didn't want to invite it. But Sophie was watching him with the calm expectation of someone who didn't think this was a big ask, who thought Emily coming over to help with a homework project was a normal thing that happened, because it had become a normal thing that happened. "Text her," he said. "Ask her yourself." Sophie pulled out the old tablet she used for homework. Emily had given her number 2 months ago, casually, without ceremony. the way you give someone your number when you've already stopped thinking of them as a stranger. And they texted with a frequency that Adrian had noticed and not commented on. 5 minutes later, she's coming at 7. Emily showed up at 7 with a black marker for the poster corrections and a small notebook she used for plant reference and a takeout bag from the Thai place 3 blocks over because, she said, she'd been passing it on the way and it seemed rude not to. Sophie accepted this as completely normal. Adrian accepted it as something else. The specific kind of gesture that wasn't meant to be romantic, and also, in its matter-of-fact ease, was exactly that. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Sophie worked, Emily helped. Adrian made tea and sat adjacent to the whole thing and occasionally answered a question and tried not to watch Emily the way he'd been trying not to watch Emily for approximately 8 weeks. She had an ink mark on her left wrist from the marker. Her handwriting on the poster corrections was clear and slightly tilted. She asked Sophie questions instead of just giving her answers, which Sophie found mildly frustrating in the moment, and which Adrian knew she'd appreciate eventually. At one point, Sophie read her conclusion aloud, and it was genuinely good. Genuine observation, not just summarized facts, and Emily said that's the kind of thing that makes teachers remember you, which was not excessive praise but was exactly the right thing to say. Sophie went to bed at 9:30. A small argument, a glass of water, a renegotiated lights-out time that both parties knew was the same as the original time, just worded differently. The usual. Adrian came back downstairs to find Emily standing at the kitchen window, holding her mug of tea, looking out at the dark backyard where the string lights were off and only the motion sensor light near the back gate was on. "She's good," Emily said without turning around. "I know. The project is actually good, like legitimately. The bit about Gerald and the soil ecosystem. She connected something that most adults wouldn't think to connect." She paused. "You're raising someone who thinks. She was like that before I did anything." "Adrian, I mean it." Emily turned around then, and there was something in the way she looked at him. Direct, a little tired around the edges in the way of someone who'd been working hard for months and was running on determination and not quite enough sleep, but steady. That made him feel the weight of the last 8 weeks all at once. "You do that thing," she said, "where you deflect." "I know. I'm not complaining. I just notice it." He looked at her across the kitchen, the ink mark on her wrist, the slight looseness of her ponytail at the end of a long day, the takeout bag still on the counter because neither of them had thrown it away yet. "Emily," he said. "Yeah. I should tell you something." She tilted her head slightly, not wary exactly, more like she was giving him space. He'd thought about this. He'd thought about it several times, not scripted, not rehearsed. Just thought about it with the awareness that it needed to happen and that he'd been letting it not happen because once it happened, it would change something, and change was the thing he'd been standing very still in front of for years. "The company," he said. "Sterling Engineering. What do you know about it?" Emily frowned slightly. "I know it's construction adjacent. You mentioned it a couple of times. Why?" "It's mine." "I know. You started it. It's larger than I think you know." He stopped. "I'm bad at this sentence." "Take your time." "It's worth around $400 million. The kitchen was quiet. Emily looked at him for a long moment. He watched her process it, not with the expression of someone recalibrating, not with the expression that he'd seen on people's faces when they learned this and started doing some kind of internal math about what it meant for them, just with the expression of someone who had been given a fact and was genuinely deciding what to do with it. "Okay," she said. "That's it? What would you like me to say?" He didn't have an answer to that. "Does it change something?" she asked. "That I know now?" "I don't know. I wanted you to know." "Because?" He looked at her. "Because you're important to Sophie. He stopped. "I wanted you to know who I was, the full version, not because I'm trying to impress you with it. I'm actually sort of aware that I drove a 5-year-old Range Rover for most of this, and that doesn't make me look like a genius billionaire. You called yourself a billionaire. I'm aware." She looked at him for another moment, and then, and this was the thing that he hadn't predicted, she laughed. Not a big laugh, not a deflecting one, just a real, slightly helpless laugh, the kind that comes when something is genuinely funny and also genuinely a lot to process. "Okay," she said again, "you're a billionaire, you garden, you make Thursday chicken, you have a rooster mailbox that is objectively terrible." I'm going to keep the mailbox. I know you are. She set down her mug. Adrian, it doesn't change anything. From my end. She paused. Does it from yours? He looked at her. No. Then we're fine. They weren't fine in the sense of unchanged. Something had moved, something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, but they were fine in the sense that the ground was still solid. That was, he thought, exactly the right kind of fine. She left around 10:30 through the side gate, pulling her jacket close against the November cold. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the light go on in her back door as she went inside. He was not, he thought, handling any of this gracefully. He was also starting to suspect that graceful wasn't the point. December came with the first real cold, the kind that made the magnolia tree look architectural against the pale sky and turned the garden into something dormant and stripped down, and he'd started to find quietly beautiful in a way that he hadn't noticed before Emily taught him to look at it differently. Things that weren't blooming were still structured, still doing work underground, still preparing for something. He'd been thinking about that more than was strictly horticultural. Sophie's school had a winter concert. Adrian went alone, as he always went, sat in the third row with his phone silenced and a good seat line for the risers and the specific pride of a parent who has been to enough of these things to know where to sit, but hasn't become so accustomed to them that they don't still get a little choked up when their kid steps up to a microphone. Sophie had a solo. 4 lines, a verse of something about winter and warmth, which she'd practiced approximately 1,000 times in the living room until she had it so thoroughly memorized that she was delivering it somewhat faster than the piano accompaniment. Adrian had gently mentioned the tempo issue. Sophie had looked at him and said she sang it at the right speed and the piano was behind. She was not wrong. The piano was slightly behind. He was watching her on the risers, small and serious and wearing the green velvet dress that she'd picked herself and that made her look like an illustration from a book, when he saw Emily come in through the side door of the auditorium. He hadn't told her about the concert. He'd mentioned it once, offhand, the week before, in the way that you mention things without quite meaning to invite someone. Emily had mentioned she might try to catch the first part if her last client didn't run long. She'd made it. She slid into the empty seat beside him 2 minutes before Sophie's class took the risers, slightly out of breath, still wearing her work fleece with the small logo of the landscaping company she'd had embroidered on it, when she'd started getting enough clients to feel like a real business. She sat down, looked at the risers, found Sophie, and exhaled. Made it, she whispered. You made it, he said. Sophie's eyes swept the audience the way they always did when she was looking for him. And when she found the row, she found him, and her face did the small thing it did when she was trying not to smile on a stage because she was being professional. And then, a half-second later, she saw Emily. And the small trying not to smile became a real smile, brief and bright, before she reassembled her stage face. Adrian watched it happen. He was glad, fiercely glad, in the specific way of a parent who has watched a child know absence and is watching them know something else, that Emily was in that seat. After the concert, in the lobby with the cheap cookies and the paper cups of punch, Sophie found Emily immediately, cutting through the crowd of parents with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where she was going, and said, with the particular intensity of 8-year-olds who care about something, "You came." "Wouldn't miss it," Emily said. "Did you hear my solo?" "Every word, a little fast." Sophie pointed at her. "That's what I said. The piano was behind." "The piano was definitely behind. Dad says I was too fast, but he's wrong." "Your dad knows a lot of things," Emily said. "He's wrong about this one." Sophie looked at her father with the vindicated expression of someone who had won an argument by proxy. Adrian shrugged. He didn't actually think Sophie had been too fast. He'd said it because it was the thing to say, the gentle correction, the parental note. He'd known from the third run-through in the living room that the piano was behind. He didn't correct himself now. He let Sophie have it. Later, walking home, the 3 of them, because Emily had parked on the street and it was 3 blocks and the cold wasn't cruel yet. Sophie walked between them and talked about the concert with the specific energy of someone processing a performance, dissecting what had gone well and what hadn't with the same blunt assessment she brought to everything she cared about. At the front walkway, Sophie ran ahead to unlock the door with her own key, which she'd been given in September and had not yet stopped finding thrilling. Adrian and Emily stood at the end of the walk for a moment. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I wanted to." The porch light was on, the rooster mailbox was dimly visible at the end of the path. The cold made small clouds of their breath. "She looked for you," he said. "On the risers. When she found you." Her face. Emily looked at him. She didn't say anything right away. "I know," she said finally, quietly. "I know." Something about the way she said it, the weight of it, the careful awareness in it, told him that she understood the same thing he did, that what was happening wasn't casual, that Sophie was attached in a real way, not a surface way, and that both of them were standing in the middle of something that had responsibilities attached to it, along with everything else. "I'm not going anywhere," Emily said. Simply, without drama. He looked at her. "I just want you to know that," she said. "Whatever, however this goes. I'm not the kind of person who shows up for someone and then disappears." He believed her. That was the thing. He believed her without caveats. He'd been lied to before, not cruelly, not deliberately, but in the way that people lie when they love an idea more than they love the person inside it. He'd spent 3 years being careful because of it, keeping his world small enough that the exits were manageable. Standing here on his own front walk in the December cold, he believed Emily Carter. Not because she'd said the right thing, but because of the 8 weeks that had come before it. The things she'd done when no one was asking her to, when there was nothing in it for her, when Sophie needed something and Emily had just been there. "I know," he said. "I think I know that." "No," she nodded. And then she said goodnight and walked toward her car, and he watched her go, and he stood there for a moment longer than made any particular sense, before Sophie opened the front door and called, "Dad, are we doing hot chocolate?" "Yes," he said. He went inside. He made hot chocolate, the real kind, from scratch, the way Sophie required, and sat at the kitchen table with his daughter, who was still wound up from the concert, still debriefing the piano situation, still wearing the green velvet dress. He listened. He answered. He was present. But part of his mind was on the front walk, and the December cold, and the way Emily had said, "I'm not going anywhere," with a simplicity that didn't perform sincerity, just had it. He didn't tell Sophie any of that, but she looked at him at one point, over the top of her hot chocolate mug, with the specific observational intensity of someone who missed nothing, and said, "She's going to be around a lot, isn't she?" He looked at his daughter. "Would that be okay with you?" Sophie considered it with the gravity it deserved. "She came to my concert," she said, "and she was on my side about the piano." "That seems like sufficient evidence." "Yeah." Sophie took a sip of her hot chocolate and got a small foam mustache and did not appear to care. "I think it would be okay." He reached over and ruffled her hair, which she tolerated for approximately 2 seconds before batting his hand away. She was grinning, though. "Dad?" "Hmm?" "You should probably stop standing at the fence so much and just talk to her." He looked at his daughter. Sophie looked back at him with the serene confidence of someone who has assessed a situation correctly and is waiting for the adult to catch up. "Good night, Sophie," he said. "Good night," she said. "Think about what I said." He did. He thought about it for a long time after she went to bed, in the quiet of the kitchen with the mugs still on the table and the lights low and the December cold pressing against the windows. He thought about standing still too long, about the specific cost of it, about water finding its level, about a woman who made too much lemonade on purpose and meant it, about the fence, about the gate that Sophie had unlatched back in August and had never properly relatched since, and how neither of them had mentioned it, and how it had stayed open all this time, just waiting for someone to walk through it with intention. He wasn't ready. He was less not ready than he'd been yesterday. He turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. The fence between the two properties was still there, still 6 feet of weathered cedar. But the gate had been open for months. January on Millbrook Heights had a specific quality of stillness that Adrian had come to recognize over 3 winters. Not peaceful exactly, but suspended, like the whole street was holding its breath between what had already happened and whatever was coming next. The garden was bare. The magnolia tree was a skeleton of itself, dignified in the cold. Emily's snapdragons were long gone, replaced by a row of ornamental kale that she'd put in late November with the practical cheerfulness of someone who refused to let a garden look abandoned just because it was winter. Adrian had teased her about the kale. She'd told him it was structural interest. He'd said it looked like something from a salad bar. She'd told him that said more about him than about the kale. They'd had that conversation over the fence on a Saturday afternoon in early December, both of them in coats, breath-making small clouds. And Sophie had been in the kitchen, visible through the glass door, watching them argue about ornamental vegetables with an expression that suggested she found the whole thing enormously satisfying. That was where things had been. Warm, deepening, honest, and carefully not yet named. Both of them aware of it, neither of them pushing, a kind of mutual patience that had its own particular tension. Not the tension of something wrong, but the tension of something that hadn't quite arrived yet, and both people knew it. And then, on a Tuesday evening in the second week of January, Adrian came home from a site visit in the city to find a car parked in front of his house that he recognized immediately, despite not having seen it in almost 3 years. A white Mercedes. New model. She'd traded up from the one he remembered. Of course she had. He sat in his Range Rover in the driveway for a moment, then he got out. Victoria Sterling. She still used the name. He'd heard from mutual acquaintances in that oblique way information travels when a social circle doesn't fully split, was sitting on his front porch steps. Not the way someone sits when they've been waiting and are okay with it. The way someone sits when they've been waiting and have had time to compose themselves into a particular version of themselves that they want you to see first. She was 35 now. She looked expensive in the specific way she'd always looked expensive. The coat was Italian, the boots were new. The hair was the same deep auburn, but cut differently, more structured. She stood up when she heard him coming up the walk, and she did it with a kind of careful ease that he recognized as practiced. "Adrian," she said. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Victoria, I know I should have called. You don't have my number anymore. I could have gotten it. Then you chose not to call." He looked at her. "What are you doing here?" She had the grace to not reach immediately for whatever speech she'd prepared. She looked at him for a moment first. Really looked, the way you look at something you're recalculating. And he understood what she was seeing. Not the man she'd left exactly. That man had been compressed, tight, so focused on work and ambition that he'd stopped being able to see much else. This man was standing on his own front porch steps in work clothes with dirt on his boots from the site and a quiet in his face that hadn't been there before. "I heard you were doing well," she said. "I'm doing fine. More than fine from what I understand." She paused. "The company. What about it?" "It's remarkable, Adrian. What you've built." He looked at her. He felt the shape of the conversation she was trying to have. The acknowledgement that led somewhere. The compliment that was also a door. He'd sat across from a lot of people who needed things from him. He knew how those conversations started. "Sophie's inside," he said. "What do you want, Victoria?" She flinched slightly. Not dramatically, just a small tightening around the eyes. She wasn't used to him being that direct. The Adrian she'd known had been careful, managed, slow to anger, and slower to say the sharp thing. "I want to see her," she said. "She's 8. I know how old she is. Do you?" He said it without cruelty, just flatly. "Because the last time you saw her, she was 4. That's 4 years, Victoria. That's more than half her life." "I know that." She looked down at the porch step, then back up. "I know what I did. I'm not here to pretend otherwise." "Then why are you here?" "Because I was wrong." She said it quietly, and to her credit, she didn't look away. "I was wrong to leave the way I did. I was wrong to walk away from her. I've spent 3 years knowing that and not knowing what to do with it, and then I started hearing things from people who know you, and I—" She stopped. "I made a mistake, Adrian. A big one. And I'm here because I want to try to fix it." He looked at her for a long moment. The thing about Victoria was that she had never been dishonest, exactly. She hadn't lied to him during the marriage or when she left. She'd said what she'd felt with a bluntness that had felt, at the time, like cruelty, but which he'd eventually come to understand was just her particular way of processing things. Fast, out loud, without much filter. He'd told her once that she said things like she was ripping off a bandage, and she'd looked at him and said, "Isn't that the kind thing to do?" He'd never fully answered that. "Does she know you're here?" he said. "No, I didn't want to. I didn't want to show up in her world without talking to you first." That at least was right. He gave her that. "Come inside, Gitz," he said. "Sophie is in her room. She'll stay there until I figure out what to tell her." He paused with his hand on the door. "I'm not promising anything, Victoria. I'm not promising you anything at all. I know. You being wrong doesn't fix what she felt. What she still feels, even if she doesn't have the words for it. I know that too. He pushed open the door. Sophie was not, it turned out, in her room. She was at the top of the stairs with her socks on, and the particular stillness of someone who had heard voices at the front door and made a decision about how much of the conversation to listen to. She looked down at the two of them in the hallway. Adrian watched her face do something complicated and private, the way faces do when a child is presented with something they've thought about many times in the abstract and is now confronted with it as a real thing standing in the front hall in an Italian coat. Sophie, he said carefully, come downstairs. Sophie looked at him. Then she looked at Victoria. Victoria said in a voice that was slightly unsteady in a way Adrian didn't think she'd planned for, "Hi, sweetheart." Sophie looked at her for a long moment. "Hi," Sophie said. Flat. Not rude, just careful in the way of someone who is taking their time. She came downstairs slowly and stood beside Adrian and did not run to Victoria or away from her. She just stood there, looking at this woman who was her mother and whom she did not, in any functional daily sense, know. The evening was excruciating in the specific way of things that are necessary and unwanted simultaneously. Victoria sat in the living room. Adrian sat across from her. Sophie sat next to her father with the deliberate positioning of someone who had decided where they stood in a situation. Victoria talked, carefully at first, then with more feeling, about the years, about the choices, about the things she said she regretted. Sophie listened. She asked one question, at one point, "Why did you go?" And Victoria answered it as honestly as she could, which was honestly enough that Adrian didn't interrupt, but it wasn't enough to change the expression on Sophie's face. Sophie's expression was not angry. Anger would have been easier to read. It was something more complex, the face of someone who had assembled a working understanding of the world without a piece that was supposed to be there, and who was now being handed the piece and finding that it didn't slot in as easily as you'd think. After an hour, Sophie said she had homework. Adrian said okay. She went upstairs. Victoria watched her go. "She's extraordinary," she said. "Yes. You did that. We both know I didn't do it alone." He paused. "But we also both know she didn't get a lot of the things she was supposed to get. She's managed. She's more than managed. But she notices the gap, Victoria. She's too smart not to." Victoria looked at the stairs. "Can I see her again?" "I don't know yet. I'm not asking for custody. I'm not asking for... I just want to know her. If she'll let me." She paused. "If you'll let me." Adrian rubbed the back of his neck. He was tired. The site visit had been long, and the drive back had been longer, and he was sitting in his own living room having a conversation he hadn't prepared for, and all he wanted, actually, if he was being honest with himself, was to go sit in the backyard and talk over a fence and drink something warm. "I'll think about it," he said. "I'll talk to Sophie. Her feelings are the ones that matter most here, not mine." Victoria nodded. She left 20 minutes later. Standing at the front door, she looked at him one more time. And there it was. The thing he'd half expected and had been watching for. The thing that complicated everything. She reached out and put a hand on his arm. "You look good, Adrian. You look different. In a good way." "Good night, Victoria." She smiled, slightly rueful. She knew he'd seen it. "Good night." He watched her car pull away from the curb. He stood at the front door for a long moment. Then he went upstairs and knocked on Sophie's door. "Yeah," she said from inside. She was at her desk but not doing homework. She was drawing something. She'd taken to drawing lately. Careful, detailed drawings of plants and insects from the backyard that Emily had encouraged. This one was Gerald the worm. "How are you doing?" he asked. Sophie kept drawing. "I don't know yet." "That's a fair answer." "She smells like a department store." He almost smiled. "Is that bad?" "It's just different." Sophie added a small segment to Gerald's body. "She doesn't look like I thought she would." "What did you think she would look like?" "I don't know. I didn't think about it. Then she was just there and she looked like a person, a regular person." She paused. "That was weirder than if she'd looked wrong." Adrian sat on the edge of her bed. "She wants to see you again. I told her I'd talk to you." Sophie kept drawing. "Is she going to be around a lot?" "That's up to you, mostly." "What about you?" "My feelings about it are separate from yours. Your feelings are what matter." Sophie looked up from the drawing. "That's a very careful way to say something." He looked at his daughter. She was, he thought, genuinely too old for her age in specific ways, and completely ate in others, and the combination was something that regularly undid him. I'm not sure what I feel about it yet either, he said. But I know that she's your mother, and that complicated things don't have easy answers, and that you don't have to decide anything tonight. Sophie looked back at Gerald. Okay, she said. Can you make hot chocolate? Yeah. Come down when you're ready. He left her to it. He made hot chocolate. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard and the fence and the dark shape of Emily's house beyond it, lights on in the back rooms. He did not go to the gate. Not that night. That night, he let things sit where they were. But Victoria Sterling did not have the quality of something that sits quietly once placed. Adrian had known that from the beginning. She called the following day. He didn't answer, and then he felt slightly cowardly about not answering and called back, and they had a 20-minute conversation that was mostly logistical, whether she could come to the house, whether a neutral location was better, whether Sophie had said anything more, how long she was planning to be in the area. That last question gave him pause. How long are you in town? I'm thinking of relocating, she said. Back to this part of the state. He said nothing. Not near you specifically, she said. I have reasons, business reasons, and other reasons. He didn't ask about the other reasons. He told Karen that evening because Karen would find out anyway, and he preferred she find it from him. Karen's response was characteristically economical. Does Emily know? He hadn't considered that Emily would need to know. He sat with that for a moment. Not yet. Tell her, Karen said. Not because you owe her anything. Because the situation is going to get complicated and she's adjacent to Sophie. She should know what's coming. Karen was, as usual, right. Adrian didn't always like being told the thing he'd already half decided to do. He told Emily 2 days later. Not over the fence. That seemed wrong for this particular conversation. He came through the gate properly, knocked on her back door, and when she opened it, still in her work clothes with a streak of potting soil on her forearm, he said, Do you have a few minutes? I need to tell you something. She looked at him for a half second, reading whatever was in his face, and then stepped back from the door. Come in. Her kitchen was small and warm and entirely herself. The kind of kitchen that had accumulated things rather than been designed, with a row of seed packets along the windowsill and a whiteboard on the fridge that said clients this week and 4 names under it, and a coffee mug that said I'd rather be digging that Sophie had given her for Christmas. He stood at the kitchen counter and told her about Victoria. The whole thing. The car in the driveway, the conversation, what Sophie had said about her smelling like a department store, what Victoria had said about relocating. Emily listened the way she always listened, not performing attention, just actually paying it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. How's Sophie? Processing. You know how she does it. Quiet first, then a lot of questions when she's ready. Yeah. Emily looked at her coffee mug. How are you? I'm fine. She looked at him. I'm managing, he said. It was unexpected. She was just there on the porch. And it's been almost 3 years, and she looked different, but also the same, and he stopped. It dug up things I thought were settled. What kind of things? He looked at her. He was standing in her kitchen on a January evening, and she was asking him with genuine openness what had been dug up in him. And the answer was that what had been dug up was partly the old grief of the marriage, and partly something sharper. The fear, which he hadn't felt in months, the fear that came from wanting something and knowing it could be taken. Old stuff, he said. I'm not still in love with her. I want to be clear about that. That's not what this is. Emily nodded, measured. I didn't think that. I just wanted to say it. I hear you. She set down her mug. What do you need from me? Right now, practically. He almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so completely her. Cutting straight to the useful thing, not performing emotion about a situation that wasn't hers to perform emotion about. Just for Sophie to know you're around, as usual, whatever usual is. I don't want anything to change for her because of this. Nothing changes for Sophie, Emily said immediately. From my end, nothing changes. He nodded. What about from yours? She asked. He looked at her. There was something in the way she asked it, not pointed, not insecure, just honest, that made the question feel like solid ground rather than thin ice. He was asking because she wanted to know, not because she was testing him. Nothing changes, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached over to the counter and picked up her coffee mug. You want tea? You look like someone who needs tea. He sat down at her kitchen table. She made him tea. They talked for an hour. About Sophie mostly. About how to handle the coming weeks. About what it would mean for Sophie to build some kind of relationship with her mother and what care that would require. Emily had a practical clarity about it that he found stabilizing. You can't protect her from the relationship. You can only make sure she feels secure enough to navigate it. Kids do better than we expect if the adults around them are honest. She said it without making it a lesson directed at him, just as a thing she'd come to believe from watching her sister navigate something similar with her kids years back. He went home around 9. At the gate, he paused. Emily. She was at her back door. Yeah. I'm glad I told you. I'm glad you did too. He went in. The kitchen was warm and Sophie had left the overhead light on as she always did, and the rooster mailbox was a dark shape at the end of the front walk, and his house was his house. It was enough. Victoria's second visit to the house happened on a Saturday afternoon when Sophie had agreed, cautiously, to spend an hour with her. Adrian had suggested the backyard, Sophie's territory, ground she was comfortable on, and Victoria had agreed to whatever he suggested, which he noted but didn't entirely trust. It went the way these things go when both people are wary and trying, careful, slightly stilted, with occasional moments of real contact. Victoria had brought a book, a nature drawing book, well chosen, the kind Sophie would actually like, and Sophie had received it with the poker face of someone who appreciated the gift and was not ready to show it. They sat at the garden table and Victoria asked questions about school, and Sophie answered them with the measured economy of someone distributing information in small quantities. Adrian stayed in the kitchen and watched through the glass door, not hovering, just present, available. 20 minutes in, Sophie showed Victoria Gerald the worm's current location in the garden bed. Victoria crouched down and looked at it with genuine attention, which Sophie noticed. Emily taught me about earthworms, Sophie said. She knows about soil systems. Who's Emily? The neighbor, Sophie said it simply. She has a landscaping business. She helped me with my ecosystem project. Adrian, watching through the glass, saw Victoria absorb this. Absorb and process. She sounds nice, Victoria said. She is, Sophie said. She came to my concert, the winter one. She was on time. The timing clause was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Victoria seemed to hear it. She looked at the garden bed rather than at Sophie for a moment, which was, he thought, the right instinct. The hour ended. Victoria said goodbye at the front door and told Sophie she'd like to come back if that was okay. And Sophie said, I'll think about it, which was something she'd clearly gotten from her father. Victoria looked at Adrian over Sophie's head as Sophie went back inside. She's wonderful, Victoria said. She is. And self-possessed in a way I wasn't at 8. She's had to be. It was not an accusation. He said it plainly because it was true, and because Victoria deserved to hear the plain version. The neighbor, Victoria said, keeping her voice even. Emily. Yes. She's a regular part of Sophie's life? Yes. Victoria nodded. She looked like she wanted to say more and was making a choice not to. Okay. Victoria. She looked at him. Whatever you're thinking about, Emily, it's not relevant to your relationship with Sophie. Those are separate things. Don't conflate them. I'm not. Good. She left. And that should have been the end of the Saturday interaction. But 3 days later, Victoria called. She'd found through some chain of networking that Adrian didn't have the appetite to reconstruct the name of Emily's landscaping business. She mentioned it casually, not threateningly, just mentioned it, said she'd looked it up, said it seemed like a nice small operation. The way she said small operation was not cruel, it was precise. Adrian recognized the precision. He didn't say anything about it to Emily, not immediately. He sat on it for a day, turning it over, wondering if he was reading too much into a single phrase. He was a structural engineer. He knew the difference between a load-bearing element and decorative facing. He knew what a small stress looked like and what it meant. Then Victoria called Emily. He didn't know how she'd gotten the number. The business website, probably, listed right there in the contact section. And Emily told him about it herself, the same evening, coming through the gate with a look on her face that was not quite alarm but was the opposite of comfortable. Your ex-wife called me today, Emily said. He closed his eyes briefly. What did she say? She was friendly, completely friendly. Emily's voice had a flatness to it that he recognized as the tone of someone describing something they're still deciding how to feel about. She said she wanted to thank me for being a positive presence for Sophie. She said she was grateful Sophie had someone like me around. See, Altaisen, a pause. And then she said she was hoping, as Sophie's mother, to be spending more time in Sophie's life, and that she was sure I'd understand that with a parent back in the picture, the dynamics might shift naturally. Adrian looked at her. She said that? Word for word, basically. Emily met his eyes. She wasn't rude about it. She was clear. He turned and walked 3 steps toward the back fence and then stopped and turned back. The specific anger he was feeling was the kind that comes with recognition. The recognition of a tactic, of something dressed up as reasonableness that was neither reasonable nor entirely honest. I'm sorry, he said. She had no right to call you. She has every right to call a business number on a public website. Emily's voice was still level. I'm not upset about the call. I'm telling you so you know. She paused. What's she actually doing, Adrian? He looked at her. He thought about soft-pedaling it. He chose not to. She's establishing something, a claim on the situation. She's seen Sophie twice, and she's already starting to define the geometry of things, who matters and how much and in what capacity. Emily looked at him for a long moment. And where does that leave me? Exactly where you were before she called. He said it with more certainty than he felt in his hands, which were slightly less steady than he'd have liked. She doesn't get to define that. She doesn't have that authority. What about Sophie? Sophie isn't going to forget who showed up. Emily looked at the dark garden. The January cold was thorough and steady. She had her arms crossed not against him, but against the cold, or maybe both. I'm not going to fight her, Emily said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to be in competition with the woman for space in Sophie's life. That's not... I don't do that. I know, but I'm also not going to shrink. She looked at him. I'm just not. I was in a marriage where I made myself smaller for 6 years because I thought that was what you did when someone needed more room. I'm not doing that again. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not. Her voice was quieter now. I just needed to say it out loud. To you. He looked at her. She was standing in his backyard in the January cold in her work jacket, slightly too thin for the weather because she'd come over without thinking to grab her coat, and she was looking at him with that steadiness she had, the steadiness that wasn't hardness, that wasn't armor, that was just the product of someone who had been through the kind of difficulty that strips you down and had come out the other side knowing what they were made of. He said, Emily, yeah, she called you because she felt threatened. By you. He paused. I want you to hear that. She saw Sophie talking about you. She understood something about what you are in this house and in Sophie's life, and she made a calculation. Emily was quiet. That's not nothing, he said. She looked at him, and something shifted in her expression, not quite surprise, but the look of someone processing something they'd heard and were putting in the correct place. Okay, she said. Okay? Yeah. She uncrossed her arms. I hear you. The cold was making itself known. She shivered slightly, which she tried not to show and showed anyway. He said, before he'd fully decided to say it, Come inside. She looked at him. It's freezing. Come inside and I'll make dinner. You can stay. A pause. Short, but present. Okay, she said. They went in through the back door into the warm kitchen. Sophie was at the table doing homework and looked up when Emily came in and said simply, Are you staying for dinner? As though it were a Tuesday and nothing had happened. Apparently, Emily said. Good. Dad's making something with chicken and I'm pretty sure he's improvising. I'm not improvising, Adrian said. He's improvising, Sophie told Emily. Adrian was, in fact, improvising. The chicken turned out reasonably well. Dinner was loud in the way it was when Sophie was talking, which was most of the time, and the kitchen was warm and the cold stayed outside where it belonged. Victoria Sterling had made a calculation. She had, Adrian thought, watching Emily laugh at something Sophie said with the easy fullness of someone completely comfortable, made the wrong one. But she wasn't done. He knew her well enough to know she wasn't done. The next move came 10 days later, arriving not with a phone call, but with a document, delivered through a family law attorney, formal and crisp and entirely unexpected, citing Victoria's renewed interest in Sophie's welfare and her intention to seek a formal custody arrangement. It was not technically a custody suit. It was an opening. It was also a message. Adrian read the document twice at his desk. Then he called his attorney. Then he sat in his office for a long time, looking at the engineering plans pinned to his wall, load calculations, structural models, everything with a formula and a fix. This didn't have a formula. He thought about Sophie's face when she'd come downstairs and seen Victoria in the hall, the careful flatness of it, the measured high that had contained 1,000 things. He thought about Emily's voice. I'm not going to shrink. I was in a marriage where I made myself smaller for 6 years. He thought about what the next weeks would look like. The legal conversation, the careful management of Sophie's experience, the question of Victoria's actual intentions underneath the document. He thought about the fact that he was afraid. Not of Victoria, exactly. Not of the legal situation, which his attorney had already told him was manageable. Victoria had been absent, and he had documentation of that. And unless she produced something significant, a formal custody change was unlikely. He was afraid of the disruption, of what it would do to the equilibrium that had taken 3 years to build, of what it would do to Sophie, who was just beginning to trust the shape of things again. And beneath that, quieter and more uncomfortable, he was afraid of what it would do to Emily, to the thing between them that was still warm and growing and had not yet been tested by anything difficult. He was afraid it was about to be. He picked up his phone. He didn't call his attorney back. He didn't call Karen. He texted Emily. Are you home tonight? The reply came in 2 minutes. Yes. Everything okay? He looked at the document on his desk. Not entirely, he typed, but it will be. Can I come over later? Her response was immediate, no hesitation. Gates open. He put down his phone. The gate had been open since August. He was starting to understand that it had been waiting for exactly this. Emily was on her back porch when he came through the gate, sitting in the wicker chair she'd finally repainted in November, a deep green that Sophie had selected from a paint chip fan with the authority of someone who considered this her jurisdiction. She had a blanket over her lap and a mug of something hot, and she looked up when she heard the latch and did not ask what was wrong. She'd read it already from the text. She just moved the blanket slightly and said, There's more tea in the kitchen if you want it. He did want it. He went in, found the pot on the stove, poured a mug, and came back out. He sat in the other chair, the one that had materialized on Emily's porch sometime in October, without either of them commenting on it, a plain wooden chair from her garage that she'd put a cushion on, and that had simply become his chair in the specific way that things become yours when no one makes a decision about it. He put the document on the small table between them. She picked it up. He watched her read it, the way her eyes moved down the page, the small tightening around her jaw when she got to the relevant section. She read the whole thing. She put it back on the table. Okay, she said. My attorney says it's likely an opening position. She's not going to get a custody change without documentation that I've been unfit, which she doesn't have because I haven't been. I know you haven't. But it's going to take a few months to resolve. There'll be evaluations, probably. A guardian ad litem for Sophie. It's going to be a process. Emily nodded. She was looking at the dark garden, her ornamental kale visible in the porch light, the stone border she'd rebuilt, the small structure of the things she'd made from almost nothing. How's Sophie? She asked. She doesn't know yet. I need to figure out how to tell her. Carefully, Emily said. Age appropriate. She doesn't need to know the legal mechanics. She needs to know she's safe and that nothing is going to happen to her without her being part of the conversation. Yeah, he paused. I know. I'm just saying it out loud because sometimes it helps to hear it. He looked at her. It does. They sat with the quiet for a minute. The January cold was thorough, but the porch was sheltered enough and the tea was hot, and the wicker chair creaked slightly every time Emily shifted her weight, which was a sound he'd gotten used to months ago, and which was, he realized, a sound he associated with feeling like himself. Why did she do this? Emily asked. Not the legal question. I get that. I mean, why now? She had 3 years. Money, he said. It came out flat because it was. Not in a simple way. I don't think she sat down and calculated it. I think she heard how well the company was doing. She came back to look. She saw something she'd given up that had grown into something larger than she'd thought it would. And some part of her responded to that. And then she convinced herself that response was about Sophie. He paused. I think she does want to know Sophie. I don't think that's entirely performance, but I think it got tangled up with the other thing, and she's not clear on the difference. Do you think she knows that they're tangled? Victoria is smart, But she's always been better at convincing herself of things than at examining whether those things are true. He thought for a moment. We were alike in that way once. I was very good at convincing myself the marriage was fine because I needed it to be fine. She convinced herself leaving was the only option because she needed it to be the only option. We were both wrong. We were wrong in different directions. Emily looked at him. You've thought about this a lot. I've had 3 years. And where does that leave you? On her? He considered it seriously. I don't hate her. I stopped hating her a while ago. Hating her was like carrying something heavy in the same hand you're trying to use for everything else. I put it down. He picked up his mug. What I feel now is mostly tired when I think about dealing with her. And careful. Because she's Sophie's mother, and that means she'll be a factor in our lives for a long time, and I'd rather manage that carefully than blow it up. Emily was quiet. What are you thinking? He asked. She looked at the garden. I'm thinking that you're being very measured about someone who just sent you a legal document designed to disrupt your life. I'm not measured. I'm tired. What's the difference? Measured is a choice. Tired is just what's left over. He set down his mug. I was angry for about an hour after I read it. Then I thought about what it would take to fight this badly. The kind of fighting where you say everything and use everything and make it as hard as possible for her. And I thought about Sophie watching that happen, and the anger turned into something else. What's something else? The decision that Sophie comes first, always, before whatever I feel about Victoria. He paused. That's not noble, that's just what it is. Emily turned to look at him fully. She had that expression she got sometimes, not soft exactly, but open, like she'd removed whatever she used to keep the distance managed. You know what's hard about you? She said. He raised an eyebrow. You think that not putting yourself first is just baseline, that it doesn't count, that a person is only doing something real if it costs them something they can feel. She shook her head slightly. It does cost you something, you just don't file it properly. He looked at her. You swallowed an hour of anger tonight, she said, because of Sophie. You've been swallowing things for 3 years because of Sophie. That's not nothing, Adrian. That accumulates. I know it accumulates. Then where does it go? The accumulated thing? He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was nowhere lately. It had been going nowhere because there had been somewhere to put it. The garden, the fence conversations, the dinners, the way Sophie was doing better than she'd been doing a year ago. And the weight had shifted without him quite noticing it shift. Things that had been heavy had gotten lighter. Not because they'd been solved, but because he'd stopped carrying them alone. He looked at Emily. She was watching him work through it. She didn't rush him. It goes here, he said. Lately. Here. He meant the chair on her porch. He meant the gate that had been open since August. He meant the wicker chair that creaked and the too much lemonade and the winter concerts and the dinners and the conversations in the dark. Emily held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. Not from discomfort, but from something more private. And he thought he could see, in the set of her jaw and the small movement in her throat, that she was doing her own filing. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay. She picked at a loose thread on the blanket. It was a thing she did when she was choosing words carefully, a small physical anchor for a not small thing. He'd noticed it before, but had never named it. When Victoria called me, she said, when she said what she said about the dynamics shifting naturally, I wasn't just not upset about it. That wasn't the whole truth. She paused. I was scared. He waited. Not of her. Not of losing. I mean, I don't have a formal claim on anything here. I know that. Sophie isn't mine, and you're not mine, and nothing about this is official or named. She stopped. But I've been here every week for 6 months. I've been at Sophie's concerts and her school projects and her birthday and the Tuesday nights and the fence conversations, and She stopped again, steadied herself. I've been falling in love with this family, with both of you. And when Victoria called and implied that my role here was provisional, contingent, something that might just naturally dissolve when a parent came back into the picture, I got scared, because she wasn't entirely wrong about the vulnerability of my position. She said it plainly, without performing it, without dressing it up. Adrian sat very still. You don't have to say anything, she said. I didn't say it to get something from you. I said it because you were being honest with me, and you're sitting here with a legal document and a mess to deal with, and you came over here to talk to me about it, and that means something. And I can't sit here being the person you came to talk to without being honest about what I just told you. The porch was quiet. The cold had crept in at the edges. Somewhere on the street, a car passed slowly. Adrian put down his mug. He turned toward her fully in the wooden chair. "Emily," he said, "look at me." She looked at him. "You are not provisional," he said. "You are not contingent. You are not something that naturally dissolves when circumstances change." He leaned forward slightly. "Victoria doesn't get to define what you are in this house. And I should have made that clearer sooner. That's on me." She was looking at him with an expression that was trying very hard not to need this, and needed it anyway. "I've been standing at the edge of this for months," he said, "and I keep telling myself I'm not ready, that I need more time, that Sophie needs me to be careful. All of that is true, and none of it is entirely the reason." He paused. "The reason is that the last time I let someone matter this much, she took Sophie's stability with her when she left, and I have spent 3 years making sure that never happens again." Emily was very still. "But I've been applying that caution to the wrong person," he said. "I've been treating what's happening here like it's the same category of thing. It isn't." He looked at her. "You are not the same category of thing." She let out a breath, small, almost inaudible. "I'm not going to make you a promise tonight," he said, "because I don't think promises made in January on a cold porch after a legal document are the right kind. But I want you to know that you are not in a provisional position. You are not a placeholder for something real. You are—" He stopped. He found the word. "You're what I come through the gate for." Emily looked at him. Her eyes were bright, and not from the cold. She said, "That's the most engineering-brained romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." He laughed. It came out of him slightly ragged, slightly relieved. "I was doing well until the end." "You were doing great until the end." She reached over and put her hand on his arm. Not to hold it, just to place it there. Present. Warm through his jacket. "We're going to be okay," she said. "You and Sophie, through this. You're going to handle it right." "So, you will. I've watched you handle things for 6 months, and you always do the right thing slightly after you've convinced yourself you don't know what the right thing is." He looked at her hand on his arm. He put his hand over hers. They stayed like that for a moment. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't the named thing that was waiting to be named. It was something that happened before those things. The moment when two people stop pretending they're not where they are. "Come inside," she said. "It's too cold out here." They went in. The next 3 weeks were difficult in the specific way of things that are happening to you while the rest of life continues to also happen. Adrian met with his attorney twice. His attorney was calm in the practiced way of someone who had managed these situations many times and found them straightforward, which was both reassuring and faintly disorienting, because the situations felt not at all straightforward from the inside. He told Sophie on a Sunday morning. He'd chosen Sunday because Sophie was generally at her most level on Sundays. She woke up slowly, had an extra pancake, and moved through the day at a slightly lower RPM than the rest of the week. He sat with her at the kitchen table after breakfast and explained in plain language without legal terminology that Victoria had formally asked a judge if she could spend more time with Sophie, and that the judge was going to ask some people to talk to all of them to make sure Sophie was okay, and that nothing was going to change without Sophie being part of the conversation. Sophie listened. She ate the last of her pancake. "Is she going to take me away from here?" she asked. "No." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He looked at her. "This is your home. You're not going anywhere." Sophie processed this. She looked at the table. "What does she want?" "She says she wants to know you better." "Okay." Sophie turned her fork over in her hands. "I don't know if I want that, but I don't know if I don't want it. I haven't decided yet." "You don't have to decide today? Will she come to the house again?" "Probably, while we figure this out." Sophie looked at the window. The backyard was still January gray, but the ornamental kale was vivid against the dark soil, and the stone border was precise. Emily's work, visible from the kitchen table. "Will Emily still come over?" Sophie asked. "Yes. Nothing changes with Emily." "Promise?" "Promise." Sophie nodded. That was apparently the load-bearing part of the conversation. Everything else was negotiable. Emily was not. He did not tell Emily that Sophie had asked about her specifically, first, before asking most of the other questions. But he thought about it. Victoria came to the house 3 times over the following weeks. Each time arranged properly, with notice, nothing showing up uninvited. She was careful. He could see her being careful, see the effort in it, and it made him simultaneously more charitable toward her and more aware that the effort was, at least partly, strategic. She brought things for Sophie, not expensive things, which was a calibration that showed she was paying attention. A small illustrated field guide to insects, a packet of sunflower seeds, a photo she'd found, old, of Sophie at 2 years old at the beach, that Sophie didn't have a copy of. That one landed differently than the others. Sophie held the photo for a long time. "I remember this," she said finally, which might have been true or might have been the thing you say when you're looking at an image of yourself and trying to locate some feeling in it. "You love the water," Victoria said. "You kept running at the waves and then running back every single time." "Did I fall?" "Once. You got soaked. You thought it was hilarious." Victoria's voice had something in it that wasn't performance. The specific texture of a real memory that hadn't been touched in a while. "You laughed for about 10 minutes. Sophie looked at the photo. "I still do that," she said. "Think things falling is funny." "I know, your father told me." Sophie looked up. "You talk to Dad about me?" "A little, when I see him." "What does he say?" Victoria looked at Adrian, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. "He says you're extraordinary," Victoria said. "In different words, but that's what it adds up to." Sophie looked back at the photo. "Can I keep this?" she asked. "It's yours," Victoria said. "It's been yours. I should have found a way to get it to you before now." Sophie folded the photo carefully and put it in her pocket. She didn't say anything else about it, but when Emily came over that evening, Sophie showed it to her before she showed it to anyone else. Emily held the photo. "You're tiny here." "I was 2. You look exactly the same, though. Same face, same expression." "What expression?" Emily tilted her head, examining the photo. "Like you've just figured something out and you're about to tell someone." Sophie looked at the photo from Emily's angle. "Yeah," she said. "Kind of." She took it back and went upstairs. Emily looked at Adrian. "How's she doing?" Emily asked quietly. "Better than I thought. Worse than she lets on. The usual combination." Emily nodded. She understood the combination. The guardian ad litem was a woman named Dr. Patricia Okonkwo. Efficient and warm in equal measure, which Adrian suspected was a professional skill she'd developed for exactly this kind of situation. She met with Sophie 3 times. Sophie reported that Dr. Okonkwo had very good snacks in her office and asked interesting questions. "What kind of questions?" Adrian asked. "About what home feels like. About what makes me feel safe. About who I talk to when things are hard." "What did you say?" "I said you. And Emily." Sophie paused. "She asked me to tell her about Emily. I told her about the ecosystem project, and the concert, and the hair braiding, and the lemonade." "The lemonade." "I told her Emily makes too much lemonade on purpose." She smiled at that one. Sophie looked at him. "Was that okay to say? About Emily?" "It was completely okay. She's part of home," Sophie said. Simply. Definitively. The way 8-year-olds sometimes say the truest things because they haven't learned yet to be careful around them. "I told her that. Emily is part of home. I don't think that was the wrong thing to say." "It was exactly the right thing," Adrian said. Dr. Okonkwo's report took 2 weeks. His attorney called on a Wednesday morning to tell him the findings were favorable, that Sophie was clearly thriving in her current environment, that her primary attachment figures were her father, and secondarily, a close family friend who had become an important, consistent presence in her life, and that while the report supported some structured visitation with her mother, it did not support any changes to primary custody. He sat with his phone after the call. He thought about calling Karen. He thought about calling his attorney back with follow-up questions. Instead, he went through the gate. Emily was in her backyard in the thin February sunshine, doing something with the stone border around the flower beds that involved a level and the kind of concentration that meant she heard him come through the gate but didn't immediately look up. "Good news?" she said, without looking up. "Good news." She looked up then. Read his face. The report. Favorable. Structured visitation for Victoria. No custody change. Emily sat back on her heels. She let out a breath that was slow and deliberate, the breath of someone releasing something they'd been carrying without meaning to show they were carrying it. "Good," she said. "Good." "Sophie is officially on record as thriving." Emily smiled at that. She's definitely thriving. The report mentions her primary attachment figures. He paused. You're in there. Emily looked at him. She told Dr. Okonkwo that you're part of home, he said. Her words. The report reflects it. Emily looked back at the stone border. She pressed a stone in with her thumb, testing its level, and it sat wrong and she adjusted it. Her hand was doing the small, careful work of someone who needed something to do with their hands for a moment. I didn't ask for that, she said, to be in a legal document. I know you didn't. It's a lot. I know. She adjusted another stone. Does it change anything, legally, for you? It documents what's true, which is useful. He paused. It doesn't change the thing itself. The thing itself was already there. Emily looked up at him. He crouched down to her level, which meant he was now also sitting on his heels in the February garden, looking at a stone border that was mostly level. He picked up one of the spare stones she had stacked beside the bed and turned it over in his hands. I want to say the thing, he said. She was watching him. I've been standing at the edge of it for months, and I'm tired of standing at the edge of it. He looked at the stone in his hand. I love you. That's the thing. I've been in love with you since somewhere around the time you told me the pepper plant was drowning because I loved it too much, which I think you meant about the pepper plant, and I understood about everything else. He looked at her. And I know the timing is complicated, and I know the last few weeks have been heavy, and I know this is a strange place to say it, crouching in a garden in February. But I've learned from the garden that the strange conditions are sometimes the right ones. Emily looked at him for a moment. Her expression was the one she had when she was taking something seriously, not performing seriousness, actually taking it in. I love you too, she said. I told you that already, sort of, on the porch. You said you were falling in love with the family. That's what I meant. I know, but I wanted to say mine plainly. And how was that, saying it plainly? He thought about it. Terrifying, but good. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not, and this was, he thought, entirely right, a perfect movie kiss. She was wearing gardening gloves. He was on his heels and slightly off balance, and the stone he'd been turning over dropped somewhere in the flower bed. And she pulled back after a moment, and they were both crouching in a February garden with cold soil under them and a stone border that was mostly but not entirely level. Your balance is terrible, she said. I'm sitting on my heels in a garden. Structural engineer, I'd expect better. The structure is fine. The footing is the issue. She laughed. He found his footing, actual footing, standing up properly. And so did she. And they stood in the winter garden looking at each other with the particular look of people who have said the true thing and are now on the other side of it, which is both lighter and heavier and entirely different from where you were before. The day Victoria Sterling's attorney called to confirm the visitation agreement was the same day Sophie came home from school and walked through the back door and into the yard and found Adrian and Emily planting the first of the spring seedlings. Too early by most standards, Emily had admitted, but the soil temperature was promising and she'd been impatient and stood watching them for a moment. What are those? She asked. Snapdragons, Emily said. Early start. We might lose some to the cold, but we might not. Sophie came over and crouched down beside the tray of seedlings. She examined them with the scientific interest she'd applied to Gerald the worm and the ecosystem project and every other living thing she'd decided was worth paying attention to. Which ones? She asked. The pink ones, Emily said. Like last year. Can I plant one? That's why there's an extra trowel. Sophie picked up the trowel. She looked at the small prepared hole in the soil. She placed the seedling in with a care that was, for an 8-year-old, genuinely impressive. Not rough, not impatient, not forgetting to check the depth. Like this? She asked. Perfect, Emily said. Sophie pressed the soil around it with both hands. She sat back and looked at it. Then she looked at her father, then at Emily, with the expression she had when she was checking the shape of something, not asking for reassurance, just confirming the geometry of the world. Adrian looked at her. Good? Sophie looked back at the seedling. Yeah, she said. Good. She stayed in the garden for the rest of the afternoon, planting things with the two of them in the February cold, not asking about legal proceedings or visitation schedules or what came next. Just planting. 3 seedlings survived into April. One of them was Sophie's. It bloomed pink, slightly crooked, leaning a few degrees toward the fence. Emily put a small stake next to it to help it stand. It did. Spring came to Millbrook Heights the way it always did. Not all at once, but in negotiations. A warm week followed by a cold snap. Crocuses that appeared too early and then got buried under a late frost and came back anyway, slightly battered, entirely determined. The magnolia tree in Adrian's backyard went from bare branches to tight buds to full bloom over the course of about 10 days in April, and Sophie documented each stage in a small notebook that had originally been for school, but had been quietly repurposed for things that mattered more. She'd started doing that with Emily, keeping a record of the garden. Not scientific exactly, more like a diary with dirt on the pages. Emily had given her a packet of stickers shaped like various insects, and Sophie had been using them as chapter markers, which Adrian thought was probably the most Sophie thing she'd ever done. The snapdragon she'd planted in February was still alive, slightly crooked, leaning toward the fence the way things do when they know where the light is coming from, but alive and putting out new growth in the tentative way of something that had survived, something it wasn't supposed to and was still figuring out what to do with that fact. Life on both sides of the fence had changed and also hadn't, which is its own particular kind of change. The kind you only notice when you look back at where you were standing before. Emily's landscaping business had grown through the winter in the way of things that are good at what they do and are given enough time. She had 14 clients now. 3 of them came through the Hendersons, one through a woman at Sophie's school who'd seen what Emily had done with the beds on Millbrook Heights and stopped her in the parking lot to ask for a card. She'd hired a part-time assistant in March, a 23-year-old named Deja, who arrived on time, worked hard, and had strong opinions about ground cover plants that Emily found both challenging and useful. The second-hand mower had been replaced. The website had been updated. The whiteboard on the fridge now had 2 columns. Adrian had not funded any of it. That had been a conversation in February, brief and clear. He'd offered, carefully, framed as a business investment rather than charity, because he was a structural engineer and he thought in load-bearing terms, and he'd tried to make the offer load-bearing rather than condescending. And Emily had looked at him with the expression that meant she'd heard the care behind it and was setting aside the offer itself. "No," she'd said. "The reframe." I heard the reframe, no. She'd paused. "I appreciate what you were trying to do, but I need this to be mine. I need to know it grew because I grew it." He'd nodded. He'd understood. He'd also privately told Karen to make sure her company appeared in 2 relevant neighborhood association newsletters as a recommended vendor, which was not funding and was not charity, and was the kind of thing that could plausibly be called a coincidence if anyone asked. Karen had looked at him when he asked her to do it. "You know she'll probably figure out it was you eventually. By then, the business will be established enough that it won't matter." Karen had said nothing else. She'd handled it. The newsletters had run. 2 of Emily's new clients had mentioned them. Emily had not yet figured out it was him. He was going to have to tell her eventually. He was mildly dreading it and also thought she'd probably laugh, which was part of why he hadn't told her yet and also part of why he would. Victoria's structured visitation had settled into something that functioned, if not warmly, then practically, which was, all things considered, a better outcome than Adrian had let himself expect in January. Every other Saturday, 2 hours, location Sophie's choice. Sophie had chosen, in order, the Botanical Garden, a movie theater, the good pizza place on 5th that Sophie had been to twice and classified as reliable, and the one that had surprised him, the backyard of the house on Millbrook Heights. That last one had required a conversation. Sophie had requested it on a Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her notebook open and a pen in her hand like she was presenting a proposal. "I want to show her the garden," Sophie said. Adrian had thought about it seriously. "Why?" "Because it's mine. Part of it's mine now, the snapdragon." She looked at the pen. "I want her to see something that's mine." He'd looked at his daughter for a moment, 8 years old, figuring out that the way to let someone into your world is to show them what you've built in it, not to pretend the world started when they arrived. "Okay," he said, "I'll let Emily know." "Emily can be there," Sophie said. "If she wants. I don't mind." He'd told Emily. Emily had said she'd be around if Sophie wanted her there and would make herself scarce if the dynamic shifted. As it turned out, Sophie had positioned it so that Emily was visible in the back garden when Victoria arrived. Not prominently, not performing anything, just there, working on something near the far beds. And Sophie had given Victoria the tour of the garden with the proprietary satisfaction of a person showing someone their work. When they got to the Snapdragon, Sophie crouched beside it and said, I planted that in February. Emily taught me the depth. It was too cold probably, but we did it anyway and it worked. Victoria had looked at the flower and then at Emily, who was close enough to hear and had continued working without making it a moment. It's beautiful, Victoria said, and she meant the flower, but her voice had a quality that meant she was also taking in more than the flower. Later, when Victoria left and Sophie went inside, Victoria paused at the gate with Adrian. She talks about Emily the way she used to talk about you when she was small, Victoria said. That possessive pride. Like she's showing you something she built. Emily is good with her. I can see that. Victoria looked at the gate. I made a mistake, Adrian, not just leaving. The custody filing, I was scared and I did the wrong thing with the fear. He looked at her. I'm not going to pretend it was about Sophie, she said. Not entirely. It was about me panicking, seeing that everything I left had grown into something bigger and better without me, and doing the thing I do, which is trying to claim a position before I've earned it. He let the honesty sit where she'd put it. I'm going to do right by her, Victoria said. The Saturdays. Show up when I say I'll show up, not try to be more than I am to her right now, which is someone she's still deciding about. She paused. Is that enough? For now? It's a start, he said. She's making room. Don't push past the edges of it. I know. He opened the gate for her. She went through it. At her car, she looked back once. At the house, at the rooster mailbox that was objectively hideous, at whatever she was taking inventory of. Then she drove away. He stood at the gate for a moment. He felt, for the first time in the entire Victoria situation, something he hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a kind of worn-down gratitude for the fact that the worst version of it hadn't happened. That Sophie had navigated it with the specific grace she had, which was not smoothness or ease, but the grace of someone who falls down and gets back up before you've fully finished wincing on their behalf. Emily appeared from the back garden. She'd heard the car leave. She stopped beside him at the gate and looked at the empty street. Okay, she said. Yeah, he said. I think actually okay. She nodded. She didn't push for more than that. She understood when okay was the right amount. They went back inside. May arrived and the garden became the best version of itself, which was not a perfect version. The rose bushes had a black spot problem that Adrian was treating with varying success, the tomato plants were going in late because of the cold April, and the ornamental kale had finally been pulled out and replaced with something Sophie called real flowers, and Emily called pansies, and Adrian called a lot of purple but fine. But it was full and alive and working at itself the way a garden does when it's been tended consistently over time, which is less glamorous than it sounds and more satisfying than you'd think. Sophie's school year was winding toward its end with the accumulated energy of a class of 8-year-olds who had collectively decided that learning was now optional and summer was a reasonable substitute. She had a presentation coming up, the culmination of the ecosystem project, expanded now into something that had required a second poster board and a small display table. And she had been preparing for it with the specific intensity she brought to things she genuinely cared about, which meant she'd been talking about it at dinner every night for 3 weeks. Gerald has a whole section now, she told them one evening. About decomposers. He's basically the main character. Gerald deserves it, Emily said. I told Ms. Chen that Gerald was foundational to the food web, and she said that was good vocabulary. She didn't know Gerald was a real worm. Sophie paused. I didn't tell her. I feel like she'd be weird about it. Some people are weird about worms, Adrian agreed. Emily isn't. Emily is a professional, Adrian said. She's required to respect Gerald. That's true, Emily said, but I would anyway. Sophie looked between the two of them with the expression she'd been wearing more frequently in recent months, a kind of satisfied taking stock, like she was checking the architecture of something and finding it holding up. She did it quickly and moved on, the way kids do when they've confirmed the thing they needed to confirm and don't feel the need to belabor it. He noticed it every time. He thought Emily did too, though neither of them had talked about it directly. Some things you hold lightly, in the open palm, because naming them too precisely makes them self-conscious. What Adrian had come to understand about loving Emily Carter, and he'd said the word to himself many times in the months since February, running it through the way you run your hand over a structural joint to feel whether it's solid, was that it didn't look like what he'd thought love was supposed to look like when he was younger and building things according to a plan he'd gotten from the wrong sources. It looked like a chair that appeared on a porch without announcement and became his chair. It looked like too much lemonade made on purpose. It looked like a woman who told him hard, true things without using them as weapons. It looked like someone sitting in a cold February garden pressing stones into a border with a level, doing careful work on something modest that would last. He had spent a significant portion of his professional life calculating what structures could bear, what loads were too much, where the failure points were, and how to design around them. He was good at it. He was very good at it. And what he'd gotten wrong for a long time was applying that same engineering to the wrong material. Trying to calculate the load-bearing capacity of a feeling. Trying to design around the failure points of a relationship before the relationship had a chance to show him whether it would stand. Emily didn't design around things. She planted in cold soil and let things struggle a little and trusted them to figure themselves out. It was not a strategy he would have come to naturally, and he was aware that he was still, in many ways, learning it. The learning was the part he hadn't expected to be as good as it was. The fight they had in June was about nothing and everything. The way fights are when they've been sitting under the surface of a good stretch for too long and finally find a crack. It started over a schedule. Emily had a client she'd double booked, which meant she'd missed a Saturday morning she'd told Sophie she'd be available for, and Sophie had been quietly disappointed in the specific Sophie way that involved saying nothing and becoming slightly less talkative for 2 days before Adrian noticed the temperature drop. He mentioned it to Emily. He did not, he thought later, mention it well. She was looking forward to it, he said. She doesn't say things like that directly. You know she doesn't, but I can tell when she... I know, Emily said. I know I missed it. I apologized to her. I know you did. I just... Adrian. Her voice had a quality he recognized. Say the actual thing. He stopped, looked at her. You can't do that to her. You can't be something she counts on and then not be there. The silence that followed had weight. I double booked, Emily said. I apologized. It's not a pattern. I know it's not. I'm not saying it's a pattern. Then what are you saying? He ran a hand through his hair. I'm saying she's gotten used to you. In a way that means when you're not there, there's a gap. And I need that to not become a thing that hurts her. Emily looked at him for a long moment. I hear what you're actually saying, she said, and I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it not as an attack. Okay. You cannot put Sophie between us as insurance, she said. You cannot use her attachment to me as a reason to preemptively brace for me disappointing her. Because if you do that, if every time I make a normal human mistake you pull out the Sophie card, then you are not trusting me. You're just waiting for me to fail. He opened his mouth, closed it. She continued steadily, without cruelty. I double booked a Saturday. I fixed it. I apologized. That's what humans do. That's what I will do again the next time I mess something up, because I will mess something up again. I'm not going to be perfect, Adrian, and if perfect is what Sophie needs for me to be safe, then I can't give her that, and neither can you. She paused. You're not actually worried about Sophie right now. You're worried about you. It landed. He felt it land. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the June evening was warm and the garden was fully itself, and through the back window he could see the snapdragon, which had leaned further into its crooked growth and was now genuinely committed to its angle. You're right, he said. I know. That's not a gracious way to accept being right. I'm not trying to be gracious. I'm trying to be honest. She looked at him. I'm in this. Fully in it. I'm not going anywhere because I double booked a Saturday, but you have to stop waiting for the exit. Every time you see a crack, you brace for collapse. Some cracks are just cracks. He sat with that. He thought about structural engineering, about the difference between a crack that indicated failure and a crack that indicated settling. The normal, expected compression of materials under load over time. A good engineer knew the difference. A bad one condemned the building. I've been a bad engineer, he said. She looked at him. What? Just a thought. He looked at her. I'm sorry, you were right. I was using Sophie as a buffer for something I should have just said directly. Which is? That I'm still scared, he said. Not of you leaving, not like before. Just of the gap. Of what it would look like in this house if something went wrong between us. I can't separate my feelings from Sophie's experience of those feelings, and sometimes that makes me handle things badly. Emily was quiet for a moment. Her expression had shifted from the pointed clarity of someone making a case to something softer, more complicated. "I know," she said. "I know you can't fully separate them. You shouldn't be able to. She's your daughter, and you love her, and anything that affects you affects her. That's just what being her father is." She paused. "But I need you to bring me the scared thing directly, not wrapped in Sophie. Just, 'I'm scared' is enough. I can work with that." "I'm scared," he said. "I know." She came over and sat beside him. "Me too, sometimes. This is a lot to be in the middle of. A kid who's mine and isn't mine. An ex-wife who shows up every other Saturday. A man who thinks in load calculations when he's trying to feel something." She bumped his shoulder. "It's a lot." He laughed, short and real. "The load calculation thing is a personality flaw. It's one of your more endearing ones." He looked at her. "We okay?" "We were okay 20 minutes ago," she said. "We were just also in a fight. Both things. Both things." He reached over and took her hand. They sat at his kitchen table with the June evening warm through the window, not performing reconciliation, just being two imperfect people who had said the hard things to each other and were still there. That was, he thought, the whole point. That was what he hadn't understood when he was younger. That the relationships worth having are not the ones where no one ever says the wrong thing, but the ones where both people know how to come back from it. Where the coming back is built into the structure, not as an emergency measure, but as part of the design. Sophie came downstairs at some point. She looked at the two of them at the kitchen table. Some antenna she had for the atmospheric pressure of rooms told her something had shifted. And she just said, "Are we doing dinner?" with the breezy tone of someone who had decided not to know more than she needed to. "Yes," Adrian said. "Can Emily stay?" "Already planning on it," Emily said. Sophie opened the refrigerator and began narrating its contents with the analytical remove of someone conducting an audit. And the kitchen filled up with her voice, and the fight settled into the past where it belonged. July came in hot, and the garden went a little wild the way it does when the heat has been consistent, and the rain has cooperated, and you've stopped trying to control everything and just let it do what it's going to do. The tomatoes came in, finally, properly, the full, ugly, gorgeous crop of them. And Adrian and Emily and Sophie spent a Saturday processing them into sauce on the kitchen stove, which was significantly messier than any of them had anticipated, and which resulted in a splatter pattern on the backsplash that was still faintly visible 3 cleaning attempts later, and that Sophie had designated the map of the tomato war. Deja, Emily's assistant, came by occasionally now. She was good company, direct, funny in a dry way that Sophie found hilarious, and that Adrian had grown to appreciate. And she had a habit of telling Emily exactly what she thought about every business decision, which Emily received with the composure of someone who'd decided that being challenged was less scary than surrounding yourself with agreement. The business was good. Not wealthy, not yet, but stable in the way that things are when they've been built on actual work and not borrowed momentum. Emily paid herself a real salary in July for the first time. She didn't make a big deal of it. She told Adrian on a Tuesday over the fence, in the way she'd told him about the first new client and the first recurring contract. And he said congratulations, and meant it without any qualification. "I keep waiting for it to fall apart," she admitted. "I know. Does that ever go away? The waiting?" He thought about it honestly. It changes. You stop waiting for the whole thing to collapse, and you start just dealing with the things that actually go wrong, which is less dramatic but more sustainable. She considered this. "That doesn't sound as reassuring as I think you meant it to." "The real version of reassurance is less satisfying than the fake version, I've found." She shook her head slowly. "You're the most pragmatic romantic person I've ever encountered. I'm going to take that as a compliment." "You should. It's the highest one I know how to give." August. The anniversary month, though neither of them had counted officially. There was no official date, no clear starting point, just the accumulation of things that added up to a year. August was the moving truck and the gap in the fence, and if you want to see, just ask said with easy deflection that hadn't been easy at all. That had been the first honest thing said between them, and neither of them had known it yet. 1 year of lemonade made on purpose. 1 year of the gate left open. 1 year of a chair on a porch. And Thursday, chicken and a worm named Gerald, and a child who pressed her hands into cold soil and grew something crooked and alive. Adrian was in the backyard on a Saturday evening in mid-August, and the string lights were on because Sophie had turned them on when she came out after dinner, and she was currently chasing a moth around the garden with the same determination she brought to all things. And Emily was in the wicker chair, and the snapdragon was in full bloom, had been for weeks, insistently pink, committed entirely to its angle. Karen had called that afternoon. The larger of the two infrastructure projects had come through. The full contract, the one that would represent the biggest revenue year in the company's history. She told him with the restrained satisfaction of someone who had done significant amounts of work toward that outcome and did not need to perform excitement about it. "Congratulations," she'd said. You built something that works." He'd said thank you. He'd sat at his desk for a moment after the call. He'd thought about the company, which he had built from a borrowed office and rice and beans, and an ambition that had felt like hunger and turned into something else over 20 years. Something quieter, steadier, less about conquest and more about doing the work right. He'd thought about what Karen had said. You built something that works. He'd thought about all the things that sentence could mean. The company. The life. The backyard with the string lights, and the person in the wicker chair, and the child chasing a moth with absolute commitment. He hadn't told Emily yet. He would. It wasn't a secret. It was just information that hadn't found its moment. But standing in the August garden with the lights warm overhead, and Sophie narrating the moth situation in real time, the contract felt like one thing on a list of things, and not the most important thing on the list. He sat down on the back steps. Emily looked over at him from the wicker chair. "You've been quiet since you came outside." Thinking. "About? Good news at work today." "Oh yeah?" She tilted her head. "How good?" "Significant. The project I've been working on for 2 years came through." Emily smiled. "That's great, Adrian. That's really great." She meant it, simply, without calculation. "It is," he said. "It's also just a number in a spreadsheet, ultimately." "Is it?" He looked at Sophie, who had abandoned the moth and was now lying on her back in the grass, looking at the string lights above her with the specific meditative quality of a child who had burned through all her energy and was now in cool-down mode. "The thing I keep thinking about," he said, "is what I thought I was building when I started. I thought I was building security, proof of something, enough that nobody could take anything important from me." He paused. "That wasn't the right project." Emily was watching him. "The right project was this," he said, "which I didn't know was a project. It just happened because a woman moved in next door and made too much lemonade, and I didn't know how to look away." Emily looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her face that was not soft, exactly, and not hard. It was the look of someone who has come a long way and is aware of the distance covered, aware of the cost of it, and is standing in a place they couldn't have pictured a year ago and finding it more solid underfoot than they dared to expect. "You know what I think about?" she said. "What?" "The call with my ex-husband. The last real conversation we had before I knew it was over. He said I was too attached to things that didn't grow, that I was obsessed with dirt and plants and small, unglamorous things when I could have been building a real life." She paused. "I think about how I almost believed him. He was wrong. He was completely wrong. But I almost believed it." She looked at the garden. Dirt and small things and patience and time. That's what everything runs on. He wanted a life that looked good from the outside fast. I wanted a life that was actually growing. She looked at Adrian. "I think I found it." Sophie rolled over in the grass. "Are you guys having a moment?" she called. "Possibly," Emily called back. Is it going to be long? Because I'm bored." "Come here then," Adrian said. Sophie came over and sat between them on the steps, positioned herself between them with the comfortable authority of someone who had claimed that geography months ago and nobody had disputed it. She leaned against her father on one side and against Emily on the other, which she did without ceremony, the way you lean against things that have held you up consistently enough that you've stopped thinking about whether they'll hold. The three of them sat there in the August evening with the string lights on and the garden doing what gardens do in August, which is everything at once and messily, and the snapdragon leaning its crooked pink lean toward the fence. Sophie said, "Emily, what are you going to plant next?" "I was thinking dahlias, for fall." "What color?" "Deep red. Maybe some orange." Sophie considered. "The orange ones by the fence," she said, "so I can see them from my window." "Deal." Sophie looked at the fence. "Dad," she said. The fence needs painting. He looked at the fence. She was right. The cedar had gone gray and was beginning to peel at the top rail. He'd been meaning to deal with it since spring. I know. Can we do it, all three of us? He looked at Emily over the top of Sophie's head. Emily looked back at him. Her expression had the quality it got when she was watching something confirm itself. Quiet, grounded, neither surprised nor performing surprise. Yeah, he said. We can do that. Sophie made a small, satisfied noise and went back to looking at the string lights. The fence got painted the following Saturday, badly, in some places, because Sophie was 8 and had strong opinions about brush technique that were not supported by results, and because Adrian had not painted a fence in his adult life and it showed, and because Emily was the only one of the three of them who actually knew what she was doing but kept getting interrupted by the other two asking questions. The job took 3 hours instead of 1, and they ran out of paint 10 feet from the end and had to do a hardware store run in the middle, and Sophie sat in the back of the Range Rover explaining to Emily why the Rooster mailbox was an important aesthetic decision, and Emily listened with a seriousness that the argument didn't technically warrant, and that Sophie found entirely satisfying. The fence was not a perfect paint job. There were drips at the bottom rail in a section near the gate where the coverage was uneven, and one post that got done at 3 different angles because Sophie had lost interest midway, and then remembered it later and finished it standing on her tiptoes. It held. It was weatherproof. It was theirs. The gate, as it had been since August a year ago, they left unlatched. This is what Adrian Sterling understood, standing at the fence on a Saturday afternoon in late August, with paint on his hands, and his daughter negotiating with Emily over the correct way to clean a brush, that the things worth having are not the things that look finished. They look like a pepper plant that survived because you stopped hovering over it, like a snapdragon planted too early in cold soil that bloomed anyway, crooked, committed, pink, like a fence with uneven coverage and drips at the bottom and a gate that nobody locks anymore because there's no longer anything to lock out. He had spent a long time confusing the appearance of stability for the thing itself. He had built structures designed to bear enormous loads, and he'd been living inside a life designed to bear no weight at all. Nothing allowed in that might hurt, nothing taken seriously enough to grieve if it left. He'd called it caution. He'd called it protecting Sophie. He'd called it a lot of things that were partially true and mostly not. What he'd actually been doing was standing still. Emily had not arrived in his life and fixed that. He wanted to be clear about that. Even in the privacy of his own understanding, she was not a solution, not a repair. She was a person. She was flawed and stubborn and occasionally wrong and had spent 6 years making herself smaller for someone who didn't deserve the accommodation, and she was still learning to take up her full amount of space without apologizing for it. And some mornings she was impatient, and some evenings she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work, and she had the infuriating habit of being right about things she said plainly and then moving on before you'd fully processed them. She had not fixed him. She had just been there, consistently, on the other side of a fence, until he'd figured out himself that the gate was open. That was the thing. The gate had always been open. The question was always just whether he was going to walk through it. He had. Sophie dropped her paintbrush and announced she was done. She was clearly done. Her contribution to the fence was vivid and enthusiastic and complete. She picked up the water bottle and drank half of it and poured the other half on the ground near the snapdragon because she'd read somewhere that August soil needed extra water, and she was, as she frequently reminded them, very aware of the garden's needs. Emily caught Adrian's eye. She had a small smear of paint on her jaw that she didn't know about. He didn't tell her. He filed it in the category of things that were hers. The ink mark on her wrist from the marker, the way her ponytail always lost the fight by mid-afternoon, the creak of the wicker chair, the too much lemonade. Good? She said. He looked at the fence, at Sophie inspecting the snapdragon, at the house behind him, and the gate beside him, and the evening light coming through the magnolia tree the way it did in August, long and golden, and not trying to be anything other than light. Yeah, he said. He meant the fence. He meant everything.